The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between a parts catalog and an overdue electric bill. Tom Hartford noticed it only because his name was written in a hand he did not recognize. Formal and careful, the kind of penmanship that belonged to another era. The envelope was heavier than it needed to be, as if the paper itself carried weight beyond ink and stamps. He stood in the small office of his garage in Denver, hands still dark with grease from the diesel engine he had been rebuilding. The radio played low in the background, classic country that had become white noise over the years. For a moment, he considered setting the letter aside. He had learned over the decades to delay unpleasant things, to place them gently at the edge of his attention and return to them when the day felt less fragile. But something in the stiffness of the envelope resisted neglect. It demanded to be opened. The letter informed him in precise and impersonal language that his grandfather had died 3 weeks earlier. It expressed condolences in a paragraph that sounded practiced, then moved quickly to the practical matter of inheritance. The farm was his, all of it. The land, the buildings, the remaining equipment. There were no conditions attached, no shared ownership, no complicated clauses. The lawyer wrote as if this were the most natural conclusion to a life, as if property simply flowed downhill from one generation to the next without friction or memory. Tom read the letter twice before it settled into meaning. His grandfather dead. The word felt abstract, almost theatrical, as though it belonged to a story he had once heard but never quite believed. Walter Hartford had always existed in a strange category in his mind, neither fully alive nor gone, a figure who lived somewhere outside the present tense. He had been old for as long as Tom could remember, old and silent and surrounded by something Tom had never been able to name. In family conversations, his grandfather's name had functioned like a closed door. You acknowledged it, then moved on. There was no sharp grief, no rush of sorrow. What Tom felt instead was a quiet, unsettling emptiness, the sense of something ending that had never properly begun. He had not seen Walter in 33 years. Phone calls had been rare, visits even rarer. Distance had become habit, and habit had hardened into something that looked like indifference but was, in truth, a form of protection. Loving him had always seemed complicated, tangled in questions Tom was never allowed to ask. He set the letter on the cluttered desk and returned to the garage floor. The engine waited, patient and mechanical. He worked until his hands found their rhythm again, until the physical motion of loosening bolts and removing parts settled his mind into something manageable. But the letter remained, a presence in the corner of his awareness, refusing to be dismissed. That evening, Tom called his brother. James answered on the fourth ring, his voice cautious as if approaching unstable ground. He had already heard the news. The lawyer had contacted him as well, if only to confirm that he had no claim. He sounded relieved when he said it, and Tom did not blame him. James had made his decision years ago, turning his back on the farm and everything it represented with a certainty Tom had never fully achieved. They spoke briefly. James asked about the property value, about timelines for selling, about practical matters that required no emotional investment. To him, the farm was a burden soaked in old shame, a reminder of stories whispered too softly to challenge. He wanted nothing to do with it. "You can sell it," James said after a pause that stretched too long. That is probably what he wanted anyway. Tom did not know if that was true. Walter had rarely spoken of what he wanted. He had lived alone on that land for decades, watching it decay around him, maintaining just enough to keep it standing. Selling it would be sensible, logical. Tom agreed with his brother easily, grateful for a solution that required no emotional investment. 2 days later, he packed a small duffel bag and left Denver before dawn. The city disappeared behind him gradually, buildings thinning and then giving way to open land that stretched toward a horizon he had not seen in decades. The road was empty at this hour, the asphalt pale beneath the early light that made everything look uncertain, provisional. He drove east and slightly north, into the part of Colorado that tourists rarely saw. This was not mountain country with its dramatic peaks and picturesque valleys. This was the high plains where the land flattened into something that felt more like absence than geography. The sky dominated here, vast and unrelenting, pressing down with a weight that made a man feel small. The radio faded in and out as he drove, stations dissolving into static and then returning with different voices, different songs. After an hour, he turned it off. The silence that filled the truck felt appropriate, almost necessary. He had nothing to say to himself and no need to fill the quiet with borrowed sound. Memories surfaced as he drove, unbidden and fragmentary. Summers on the farm when he was young, before everything had gone wrong. Walter teaching him to read the weather and the color of the sky, in the way the wind moved through wheat, the smell of diesel and dust, the particular sound of the grain elevator in town, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the property. Then his father's death when Tom was 14, a tractor accident, sudden and absolute. His mother's retreat into a grief so complete, it was like watching someone disappear while still breathing. Walter had taken Tom and James in without discussion, as if there were no other option. But the house had felt wrong after that, full of unspoken things that grew dense and suffocating. The accusation had happened when Tom was 11, 3 years before his father died. He remembered it in pieces, like a photograph torn and reassembled badly. Adults whispering in doorways. Kids at school asking questions he could not answer. Is your grandpa a murderer? Did he kill that man? Where did he hide the body? He remembered Walter's face at dinner, not defending himself, not explaining, just enduring. Tom had asked once, only once, the question direct and childish in its simplicity. Did you do it, Grandpa? Walter had looked at him with eyes that seemed very tired and said, no, nothing more. No elaboration, no reassurance, just a single word offered without expectation that it would be believed. Tom had learned not to ask again. The silence became a permanent condition, something they all adjusted to without acknowledging. By the time Tom was 19 and desperate to leave, the silence had become unbearable. The argument, when it finally came, was about college, about the military, about anything except what it was really about. Walter had stood in the kitchen and said the land was family, 3 generations of work and sweat. Tom had said he did not want it, did not want any of it. Your grandfather's words had been quiet but final. This land will bury you, just like it buried me. Tom's response had come fast, angry, unforgivable. Then I will leave before it can. He had left the next morning and had not returned. Not for holidays, not for his mother's funeral 5 years later, not for the decades that followed. Letters from Walter arrived occasionally, brief and factual, reporting on weather and crop prices and the health of machinery. Tom responded even more rarely. The distance between them had calcified into something that could not be crossed. Now Walter was gone and the distance remained permanent and irreversible. The town of Cedar Ridge appeared gradually, not as a single revelation, but as a series of confirmations. A water tower first, pale against the sky. Then grain elevators, their cylindrical forms unmistakable. Houses began to cluster along the road, small and square with yards that blurred into fields. The main street consisted of a single commercial block, buildings made of brick that had weathered into muted colors. Tom did not stop. He drove through without slowing, noting the changes and the things that had not changed. The diner was still there, its neon sign faded but functional. The hardware store, the bank, the post office. A few businesses had closed, their windows empty and dark. Others had replaced them, new names on old buildings. No one looked up as he passed. It was mid-morning on a weekday, and the town moved at the pace of work and routine. He was just another truck on the road, anonymous and unremarkable. The farm lay 8 miles beyond town, accessible by a county road that had not been paved in Tom's lifetime. Gravel rattled against the undercarriage of the truck as he turned off the main highway. Fence posts marked the edges of properties, some straight and maintained, others leaning at angles that spoke of years without repair. He recognized the land before he recognized the structures. The particular roll of the hills, the line where wheat fields met pasture, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the creek. Then the farm itself came into view, and something in his chest tightened. The house stood where it always had, but it leaned now, settling into the earth with a resignation that seemed almost intentional. The porch sagged, its boards uneven. Windows stared out, dark and empty. Paint had peeled away in long strips, leaving bare wood exposed to weather. It looked like a building in the process of forgetting what it had been. The barn was worse. Part of the roof had collapsed inward, and the remaining structure tilted at an angle that defied gravity. Machinery sat rusting in the yard, half consumed by weeds that had grown tall and then died back and grown again in cycles that left layers of decay. But the corn crib stood solid. Tom stopped the truck and sat with the engine idling, staring at the structure. It rose taller than the surrounding buildings, its wooden slats weathered but intact. The roof showed recent repair, new shingles mixed with old. The foundation looked level, the supports firm. Someone had maintained this building with care, while everything else slowly surrendered. He turned off the engine. The silence that rushed in was profound, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of wind moving through dry grass. He sat for a long moment, unwilling to open the door, unwilling to fully arrive. Finally, he moved. The air outside was cool despite the sun, carrying the smell of dust and something faintly sweet, like grain left too long in storage. He walked toward the house slowly, boots scuffing against hard-packed earth. The front door was unlocked. It opened with a creak that sounded too loud, too deliberate. Inside, the air was thick with dust and stillness. Light fell through windows in pale shafts, illuminating particles that hung suspended, disturbed by his entrance. Everything remained exactly as he remembered, and yet felt utterly foreign. The furniture stood in its accustomed places, worn smooth by decades of use. A coffee cup sat in the sink, a thin film of something dark dried at the bottom. Reading glasses rested on a Bible on the side table. Boots waited by the door, laces still tied, ready to be stepped into. It was as if Walter had simply stepped out and forgotten to return. Tom moved through the rooms with the caution of an intruder. Each object seemed weighted with significance he could not decode. Photographs on the wall showed faces from another time. His grandmother, dead before he was born, his father as a young man, squinting into sunlight. Tom himself at 8 or 9, grinning beside a tractor, the gap in his teeth visible even in the faded image. The divide between that boy and the man he had become felt unbridgeable. In the kitchen, he found more evidence of solitary routine. A single plate, a single fork, a single glass in the drainer beside the sink. Cupboards held canned goods arranged with military precision. The refrigerator, when he opened it, was nearly empty. Condiments, a jar of pickles, bread that had gone to mold. The bedroom upstairs was spare to the point of severity. A bed with blankets pulled tight. A dresser with nothing on its surface. Clothes in the closet, work shirts and jeans, all similar, all worn. No decoration, no personal items beyond the purely functional. This was how Walter had lived, alone in rooms that echoed, performing the small rituals of survival without witness or variation. Tom descended the stairs and stepped out onto the back porch. From here, he could see the full extent of the property. Fields stretched in every direction, overgrown now with weeds that reached toward his knees. What had once been wheat and corn was now just wild grass, bending in waves under the steady wind. He walked the perimeter slowly, letting his boots find the paths worn by years of Walter's passage. Rusted machinery sat where it had last been used, implements whose names he had once known on but had now forgotten. Everything bore the marks of neglect, but not of abandonment. Someone had been here until the very end, keeping just enough alive to say the place still functioned. The corn crib drew him like a question. He circled it once, studying it from every angle. The ground beneath it was worn smooth, as if Walter had stood here often, perhaps more often than anywhere else on the farm. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, Tom could see the pale yellow of dried corn packed densely inside. More than seemed reasonable for a farm this size for a man farming alone. He did not understand it. Corn was meant to be harvested, sold, used. Letting it sit year after year served no practical purpose. Yet Walter had maintained this building, had kept it filled, had treated it with a care he had not extended to anything else. The thought unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. By late afternoon, fatigue had settled into his bones. He sat on the porch steps and called the real estate agent whose name the lawyer had provided. He left a message that was brisk and impersonal, asking about selling farmland, about timelines and valuations, about what needed to be cleared before listing. It felt good to reduce the place to logistics. Plans gave shape to uncertainty, provided handholds in terrain that otherwise felt too slippery to navigate. That night he slept poorly in the old house, waking to unfamiliar sounds and the persistent sense of being watched by the past. Morning light revealed dust motes drifting through the air, slow and deliberate. He made coffee on a stove he barely trusted and sat at the kitchen table with a sense of displacement so complete it was almost physical. He made a list because lists created order. Clear out the house, assess the equipment, dispose of anything that would complicate a sale. The corn crib topped the list. The corn was useless now, too old for anything but animal feed, and even that would require sorting and hauling. He considered burning it, then dismissed the idea as excessive. Giving it away seemed easier. There were still farmers in the area who might take it, if only to save on costs. Clearing it would make the land more presentable, less haunted by evidence of neglect. He stood again before the corn crib that morning, hands resting against the rough wood. A flicker of hesitation passed through him, something he could not explain and did not try to. It passed quickly, swallowed by practicality. He had come here to finish things, not to linger. The sooner the farm was emptied, the sooner he could leave. He did not yet know that the structure he intended to dismantle was the only part of the farm Walter had truly protected. He did not know that the silence surrounding his grandfather's life had been carefully built, layer by layer, like the corn packed tightly inside. He only knew that something had been left behind, waiting, and that by deciding to clear it away, he had already crossed a line he would not be able to see until it was far behind him. The next morning arrived cool and still, the sun lifting itself slowly above the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek. Tom began early, before the day had fully committed to warmth. The air carried the smell of damp earth and old wood, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten without warning. He told himself again that this was simply work, no different from clearing out an attic or sorting through boxes after a move. Objects once stripped of sentiment were just objects. Grain was grain, wood was wood. The past, he reminded himself, had no physical weight unless one chose to give it form. The corn crib loomed quietly in the pale light, casting long shadows across the ground. Up close, the structure revealed a care that surprised him. The boards were weathered but solid, reinforced where they needed to be, repaired at the joints with patient attention. Someone had returned to this place again and again, tightening what loosened, replacing what rotted, ensuring that it endured. It did not resemble the rest of the farm, which bore the marks of gradual surrender. This building had been preserved with something approaching devotion. He pulled on work gloves and slid the door open. The smell that rushed out was dry and almost sweet, thick and unmistakable. Inside, the space was packed, tightly with corn on the cob, stacked in layers that rose higher than his head. The cobs were pale and brittle, their husks curled inward, whispering faintly when disturbed. Dust floated in the slanted light, settling on his sleeves and hair. Tom started methodically, lifting armfuls of corn and dropping them into empty crates he had dragged inside. The work was repetitive and heavy, the kind that forced the body into rhythm and left the mind free to wander. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool air. His arms ached, then settled into a dull, manageable burn. Time stretched and folded in on itself, marked only by the gradual lowering of the piles around him. He worked without pause, finding in the physical labor a kind of meditation, a temporary reprieve from thought. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. Walter standing at a distance during childhood visits, watching rather than participating, his hands always busy with something small and precise. The old man had spoken little, and when he did, his words were careful, measured, as if each one had to justify its existence. Tom had never known how to speak to him, had never found the right questions to ask. Now, surrounded by the evidence of Walter's labor, he wondered what it had cost the old man to maintain this place alone. What bargain had been struck with silence? What compromise with isolation? By mid-morning, he had cleared enough to notice a change. The deeper layers of corn felt different beneath his hands. The cobs were arranged more tightly, packed with a deliberate precision that went beyond storage. He paused, fingers resting against the dry husks, and frowned. It was subtle but undeniable. Someone had been intentional here. He continued more slowly, paying attention now. The light shifted as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the back of the crib in a pale glow. It was there, near the rear wall, that his hand struck something solid beneath the corn. Not wood, not the rough give of dried grain. Something smooth, resistant. His first thought was an old tool, perhaps forgotten and buried. He cleared around it carefully, his movements suddenly cautious. As more corn fell away, the shape emerged. A bundle wrapped tightly in oilcloth, the fabric darkened with age but intact. It was wedged between layers of cobs, as if the corn itself had been used as insulation. as protection. Tom stood very still, the bundle cradled in his hands. His heartbeat quickened, a sharp contrast to the steady pace he had fallen into. There was no logical reason for alarm, yet unease crept up his spine, cold and insistent. People did not hide things like this without purpose. He carried the bundle outside into full sunlight, setting it on an overturned crate where the light was better. For a long moment, he simply looked at it, his hands hovering but not touching. The cloth was tied with twine, knotted securely, multiple times. The care taken in its wrapping spoke of time and intention, of someone who had not been improvising. When he finally untied it, the contents revealed themselves slowly. Papers, folded and refolded, their edges yellowed and brittle with age. A stack of old photographs bound together with a rubber band that crumbled at his touch, leaving brown residue on his fingers. Newspaper clippings, carefully trimmed, their headlines still legible despite the years. And a notebook, small and worn, its cover smooth from handling. Inside, page after page, filled with handwriting he recognized immediately. Angular, precise, economical. Walter's hand. The sight of it sent a strange chill through him. He had seen that handwriting before, on the rare letters his grandfather had sent over the years. Each one had been brief and factual, reporting on weather and machinery, never venturing into territory that required emotion or explanation. But these pages were dense, crowded with words, as if Walter had been afraid to leave anything unsaid, as if he had been writing against forgetting, against the erasure of time. Tom began to read without fully realizing he had decided to. The first page was dated, the year 1983, the handwriting slightly less controlled than in later entries, suggesting youth or urgency or both. Names leapt out. Some were unfamiliar, others vaguely recognizable from childhood conversations he had half overheard and not understood. There were dates, specific and repeated. July 16th appeared again and again, circled, underlined, returned to like a wound that would not heal. He flipped through the pages, scanning, trying to grasp the shape of what he held. Official documents were mixed among the personal pages, stamped and signed, their language formal and severe. Investigation reports, witness statements, legal correspondence. One word appeared with a frequency that formed a pattern he could not ignore. Accusation. Tom sat back heavily, the crate creaking beneath his weight. His mind struggled to connect what he was reading with the quiet, withdrawn man he remembered. The documents spoke of an investigation, of allegations made decades earlier. They hinted at land disputes, at disappearance, at questions that had unsettled the region for years. Walter's name appeared in places Tom had never imagined it would, linked to words that carried both legal and moral weight. Suspect, person of interest, uncooperative, flight risk. He flipped through the photographs with hands that had begun to shake. Black and white images of fields and fences, of men standing together in stiff, formal poses, of land boundaries marked by wooden posts that looked temporary and uncertain. On the back of one photograph, Walter had written a single date and a location in his careful hand. On another, a name had been crossed out so heavily the paper had nearly torn, the pressure of the pen creating grooves he could feel with his fingertips. Tom looked up from the papers, his gaze finding the corn crib. The structure stood unchanged, patient and solid in the morning light, but his perception of it had altered completely. What he had assumed was neglect or stubbornness now took on a different meaning. The corn had not been left to rot out of apathy. It had been left because it served a purpose. It concealed, it protected, it preserved what could not be safely kept anywhere else. His breath felt shallow. Questions crowded in, overlapping and insistent, each one spawning others before it could be fully formed. Why had Walter kept this hidden? Why here of all places? And why had no one ever spoken of it directly, in terms that could be understood? The silence that had surrounded his grandfather's life had not been accidental. It had been constructed deliberately, maintained across decades. And Tom, by refusing to ask, had helped build it. He gathered the bundle again, this time with care bordering on reverence, and carried it into the house. The kitchen table, thick with dust, became his workspace. He wiped it down methodically, then laid the papers out, smoothing them as best he could without causing further damage. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn. Inside, time narrowed to the pages in front of him, to the words written in his grandfather's hand, to the story that was beginning to take shape from fragments and careful documentation. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, changing the angle of light through the windows. Tom read chronologically, sorting the documents into rough piles, official records in one stack, personal notes in another, newspaper articles reporting developments that seemed to stop abruptly, as if the story had lost public interest before reaching any kind of resolution. The deeper he went, the clearer one thing became. Whatever had happened all those years ago, it had not been simple, and it had not ended cleanly. By late afternoon, a different kind of fatigue set in, not in his muscles this time, but in his thoughts. The weight of what he had found pressed down on him, heavy and unfamiliar. He had come here to dismantle a farm, to erase it from his life with a signature and a sale. Quick, clean, final. Instead, he had uncovered a past that refused to stay buried. He stood at the window, looking out at the corn crib in the fading light. The structure seemed unchanged, indifferent to his turmoil. But he was not unchanged. The building was no longer just an obstacle to be cleared, no longer simply a relic of outdated farming practice. It was a container, a deliberate archive disguised as agricultural necessity. He knew with a certainty that it surprised him that he could not simply throw the corn away now. Whatever lay hidden in that structure demanded attention. Ignoring it would be an act not of practicality, but of choice. And choices, he was beginning to understand, had consequences that extended far beyond property lines and sale prices. As darkness settled over the farm, he closed the curtains and gathered the papers into a single stack, tying them carefully with fresh twine he found in a kitchen drawer. Sleep did not come easily that night. His mind replayed the images he had seen, the words he had read, weaving them into questions that had no answers yet. Outside, the corn crib stood silent in the darkness, holding what remained of its secrets, waiting for him to return. Morning arrived reluctantly, the sky pale and uncertain. Tom woke with the uncomfortable sensation that he had not fully left the previous day behind, that the documents spread across the kitchen table still occupied some part of his mind even in sleep. For several seconds he lay still in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the old house settle around him. The quiet was punctuated by faint creaks that sounded almost deliberate, as if the building itself were speaking in a language he had forgotten how to understand. Then memory returned in a rush, and with it, the weight of what he had found. He rose and dressed, moving through the motions of morning with mechanical precision. Coffee brewed on the ancient stove filled the kitchen with a smell that was both comforting and alien. He carried the mug to the table and stood over the papers as if they might have rearranged themselves overnight into something simpler, something he could comprehend and then dismiss. They had not changed. The handwriting, the stamps, the dates were all still there, patient and unmoved. He sat down and began again, this time with more care, less urgency. If these pages were to mean anything, he would have to understand them fully, not as fragments but as a whole. He would have to inhabit the timeline they described, follow the logic of events as they unfolded, try to see what Walter had seen. The earliest documents were decades old, their edges soft from handling. The ink faded but still legible. They spoke of ordinary things at first: land boundaries, water rights, the small disputes that arose between neighbors in places where property lines mattered and resources were scarce. Walter's name appeared in these early records without any particular emphasis. Just another farmer navigating the complexities of ownership and inheritance, the mundane bureaucracy of rural life. Then something shifted. The tone changed, subtle at first, but unmistakable once he learned to recognize it. A missing signature here, a delayed filing there. Small irregularities that would have meant nothing in isolation, but that, taken together, began to suggest a pattern. He cross-referenced dates, matched them against the newspaper clippings he had found. The pattern emerged slowly, like an image developing in darkness. Something had changed abruptly in the year the accusations began. The careful neutrality of earlier documents gave way to language that carried implication, suggestion, the weight of suspicion. The newspaper articles were the most difficult to read. They were written in the clipped, confident language of local reporting, heavy on implication and light on verification. A man had disappeared. A land dispute had been ongoing. Questions lingered. Suspicion settled quickly, and once it did, it had not moved. Walter's name was mentioned alongside words that carried a moral verdict long before any legal conclusion. There were no follow-up articles proclaiming guilt or innocence, only a gradual fading of coverage, as if the story had grown inconvenient or uninteresting or both. Tom leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, trying to reconcile the public narrative with his private memories. The man who had fixed broken chairs rather than buying new ones, who had fed stray animals without comment, who had never defended himself when family members spoke of him with thinly veiled discomfort. Had this been why? Had Walter learned early on that explanations were useless once a narrative had taken hold? That defending himself would only deepen suspicion, make him appear guilty of the very thing he denied? The silence had not been weakness. It had been strategy, or perhaps just exhausted acceptance. Tom spent the rest of the morning reading and rereading, filling a notebook of his own with observations, questions, connections he could not yet prove but that felt important to record. By noon, one thing had become clear. The case against his grandfather, such as it was, had rested on assumption as much as evidence. Witness statements were referenced but not included in the documents he had found. Key pieces of information seemed to be missing. Gaps in the record that felt deliberate rather than accidental. And the land that had once belonged to Walter, the 60 acres that had sparked the initial dispute, was now owned by someone else. Someone whose name appeared repeatedly in the margins of Walter's notes, always accompanied by brief, sharp observations written in a hand that grew more controlled, more careful as the years passed. He decided he could not understand this story from paper alone. That afternoon, he drove into Cedar Ridge for the first time since his arrival. The town had changed less than he expected, or perhaps he had simply forgotten how small it was. The main street still consisted of a handful of shops clustered together, their signs faded but familiar. People moved at an unhurried pace, stopping to talk in doorways, their conversations pausing when he drove past. He felt their eyes on him, measuring, recognizing something in his face or his truck, or simply in the fact of his presence. He was a stranger here now, but not quite. He carried markers they could read, bloodlines they remembered. The hardware store was his first stop. He needed supplies to secure the house, to make it habitable for however long he decided to stay. The owner, a man in his 60s with the name Earl stitched on his shirt, looked up from the register as Tom entered. His expression shifted through several stages, recognition arriving slowly and then settling into something carefully neutral. Tom selected what he needed, carried it to the counter. Earl rang up the purchase in silence, his movements efficient and practiced. It was only when he saw the credit card, saw the name Hartford printed there, that he paused. "You are Walter's grandson," he said. "Not a question." Tom nodded. Earl was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the counter. "He was a customer here for 40 years, he said finally. Quiet man, never caused trouble, always paid his account on time." Another pause, heavier this time. "I am sorry for your loss." The words were formal, carefully chosen. They carried neither warmth nor hostility, just a practiced sympathy that felt genuine despite its restraint. Tom thanked him and left, carrying his purchases to the truck under a sky that had begun to cloud over. The diner was next. He had not planned to stop, but hunger and a sudden reluctance to return to the empty farm pulled him through the door. The interior was exactly as he remembered it. Vinyl booths, a long counter, the smell of coffee and frying meat. A few customers sat scattered throughout, their conversations falling quiet as he entered. The woman behind the counter was older now but recognizable. Beth something. She had worked here when Tom was young, had served him pie on those rare occasions when Walter brought him to town. She approached with a coffee pot and a menu, her eyes taking him in with the same careful assessment he had felt from Earl. "You left young," she said, pouring coffee without asking. 19, Tom replied. "Long time to be gone." "Yes, ma'am." She refilled the cup he had not yet touched and gestured toward the corner booth. "Your grandfather came in Tuesdays. Sat right there. Never caused trouble. Paid his check. Said thank you every time." Her voice carried a weight that suggested apology or perhaps regret, though for what exactly she did not say. Tom ordered food he did not particularly want and ate it slowly, aware of being watched from the corners of the room, aware that his presence here meant something he did not yet fully understand. At the grocery store, an older woman stared at him from across the produce section, her expression caught between recognition and something else. When their eyes met, she looked away quickly, as if ashamed. The young clerk at the checkout, no more than 20, had no idea who Tom was. That generation did not carry the story. They stocked shelves and made change and went about their work unburdened by the weight of other people's histories. Tom drove back to the farm with a truckload of supplies and a mind full of observations he could not yet organize into meaning. The town had not been hostile exactly, but it had been careful, guarded, as if his presence required a response they had not yet decided how to give. The real estate agent called that evening. Susan Parks, professional and courteous. She had done preliminary research on the property, had spoken to a few potential buyers. Her tone was apologetic before she even delivered the news. Mr. Hartford, I will be honest with you. This land has a history, nothing proven, nothing on record that would legally complicate a sale. But people remember. And in a place like this, memory matters. It may take longer than you hoped. What kind of history? Tom asked, though he already knew. Susan chose her words with visible care. There was an incident. A long time ago, a man disappeared. Your grandfather was questioned but never charged. People have long memories about things like that. My grandfather was innocent, Tom said. The words came out harder than he intended. I am not suggesting otherwise, Susan replied quickly. I am just preparing you for what the market will be like. These things take time. After she hung up, Tom sat on the porch and watched the sun descend toward the horizon. He had planned to list the farm and leave, quick and clean. But something had stopped him. Not just the discovery in the corn crib, though that was part of it. Something deeper, more stubborn. Running again felt like surrender, like the final confirmation of guilt in a trial that had never officially taken place. He returned to the corn crib as evening settled over the land. The structure stood solid in the fading light, its presence both ordinary and weighted with significance he was only beginning to grasp. He had cleared perhaps a quarter of the corn, enough to reveal the care with which it had been packed, the intentionality of its preservation. This was not storage. This was not neglect. This was something else entirely. He pulled on his work gloves and resumed the task, lifting armfuls of dried cobs and stacking them outside. The work settled him, gave his hands and body something to do while his mind continued to turn over the day's observations, the fragments of understanding that had not yet cohered into clarity. 3 feet deeper into the crib, his hands found another bundle, smaller than the first, wrapped in the same oilcloth, tied with the same careful knots. He carried it outside and unwrapped it with hands that no longer shook, that had accepted this was how secrets revealed themselves. Slowly, layer by layer. Inside were more photographs, older, more fragile. Images of land boundaries, of fence posts and survey markers, of men he did not recognize standing in fields that might have been Walter's or might have been somewhere else entirely. On the back of each photo, Walter had written careful notes, dates, locations, names, and one photograph that stopped Tom completely. 2 men standing together, unsmiling but not hostile. Younger versions of themselves before time and circumstance had drawn them into opposition. On the back, in Walter's precise hand, a single line, Frank Carver and me, 1978. Before everything changed. Tom sat on the overturned crate with the photo in his hands and understood something fundamental. Whatever had happened between Walter and Frank Carver had not started with hatred. It had started with something else, neighborliness perhaps, or at least the absence of animosity. The conflict had come later, imposed or cultivated or simply allowed to grow until it consumed whatever had existed before. He stayed outside as darkness fell completely, the photo still in his hands, trying to imagine the version of his grandfather who had stood beside Frank Carver in sunlight, both of them unaware of what was coming. When he finally returned to the house, he placed the photo on the kitchen table beside the other documents. The archive was growing. The story was taking shape. And Tom was beginning to accept that he could not leave, could not sell, could not walk away until he understood what Walter had preserved here with such deliberate care. The farm was no longer just property. It was testimony, evidence of something that had been buried but not destroyed, hidden but not forgotten. And he was the only one who had come looking. He called James late that night, knowing his brother would be annoyed by the hour, but needing to say the words aloud to someone who would understand their weight. I am not selling, Tom said when James answered. Not yet, maybe not for a while. James was silent for a long time, then, quietly, more resignation than anger in his voice, he asked why. Because Grandpa left something here. Tom said. "Something that matters, and I need to know what it means." After James hung up, Tom sat in the darkness of the kitchen and felt the full weight of the choice he had just made. He had come here to close a chapter. Instead, he had opened a book that had been sealed for decades. Outside, the corn crib stood in moonlight, still holding most of what it had been built to protect. Tomorrow, he would return to it. Tomorrow and the day after. However long it took to reach the bottom, to find whatever else Walter had hidden there. The truth had waited 40 years. It could wait a little longer, but not forever. Tom spent the next 3 days reading, not in the hurried way of a man trying to finish something, but with the patience of someone learning a new language, studying the grammar of events that had shaped his grandfather's life and, by extension, his own. He developed a rhythm, morning coffee first, brewed strong and black on the old stove that rattled when it heated, then to the kitchen table where the documents lay spread in an arrangement that had become familiar. He read chronologically, starting with the earliest papers and moving forward through time, watching as the story accumulated weight and shadow. The light changed throughout the day, moving across the papers in slow arcs, illuminating different sections at different hours. He learned to read by this light, to let the natural passage of time dictate his pace. When his eyes grew tired or his mind too full, he would walk. Not far, just to the edge of the property and back, letting his boots find the paths Walter had worn into the earth over decades of similar walking. The afternoons he reserved for notes. He filled a spiral notebook with observations, questions, connections he could not yet prove but felt important to preserve. The act of writing by hand slowed his thoughts, forced him to consider each word before committing it to paper. It was a discipline he had not practiced in years, and he found in it a kind of meditation. Evening brought a return to the documents, a second reading of what he had covered in the morning, searching for details he might have missed, patterns that revealed themselves only upon repetition. Walter's notebook became his primary text. The old man had been a meticulous record keeper, noting not just events but his observations about them, the small inconsistencies and coincidences that official reports overlooked or chose to ignore. The earliest entries from 1981 and early 1982 documented ordinary friction between neighbors. Frank Carver's cattle had broken through a fence and damaged a section of Walter's wheat crop. Walter had fixed the fence and sent Carver a bill for the crop damage. Carver had paid it, though the check had taken 3 weeks to arrive. Minor disagreements about water rights during a dry summer. A dispute over a property line that had been settled amicably after both men consulted old survey maps. Nothing in these early entries suggested animosity, just the normal adjustments of men whose land touched, whose interests sometimes conflicted, who worked out their differences through the practical mechanics of rural life. Then in late 1982, the tone shifted. Howard Carver Sr. appeared in the notebook for the first time. Frank's father, a man of influence in the county, owner of a ranch that sprawled across several sections, holder of positions on various boards and committees that govern local affairs. Walter's entry was brief but pointed. Howard Carver stopped by today, wanted to know if I was interested in selling the 60 acres along the north boundary. Said Frank was looking to expand, needed more grazing land. Told him no. Land has been in my family since 1923, not interested in selling. He said I should think about it. Said a man never knows when he might need friends in this county. Tom read the entry twice, parsing the careful language. The offer itself was normal enough, but the final line carried a weight that transformed it into something else. Not quite a threat, but not quite neutral either. A suggestion of consequences left deliberately vague. The next several entries documented increasing pressure. Howard Carver returning with a higher offer. Then another. Frank Carver appearing at Walter's door with paperwork already drawn up, looking uncomfortable, saying his father had sent him. Walter refusing each time, his language in the notebook growing more terse, more guarded. June 1983. Howard Carver at the feed store when I went to buy seed. Loud enough for others to hear, said I was being stubborn over land I barely farm anymore. Said a smart man knows when to take a good offer. I said nothing. Better to stay silent than say what I was thinking. Tom could feel his grandfather's frustration in the controlled precision of those sentences. The discipline required to record the encounter without anger, without the satisfaction of a response that would only make things worse. Then came July 1983, and everything changed. The entries for that month were longer, more detailed, written with a kind of careful urgency. Walter had known something significant was happening, had understood the importance of documentation even as events unfolded. July 14th, Town Council meeting. Howard Carver on the agenda, proposing a review of property boundaries in our section. Says old surveys are inaccurate, causing confusion and disputes. Council agreed to bring in a surveyor. I objected, asked why this is necessary when there have been no recent disputes. No one answered directly. Meeting moved on. July 16th. Frank Carver came to the house this morning. He looked troubled, said he did not want problems between us. I told him there were no problems as far as I was concerned. He said his father was angry about the land, about my refusal to sell, said I should be careful. I asked what he meant. He did not answer, just got in his truck and left. July 16th. Later. Drove past the disputed boundary this evening. Saw vehicle tracks in the field. Recent. Tire patterns looked like Howard Carver's ranch trucks. Could not tell what they had been doing. Made note of location. July 16th. Night. Heard a truck on the county road around midnight. Unusual for that hour. Seemed to be coming from the direction of Carver's property. Could not see it from the house. Windows closed because of heat, air conditioner running. Thought about going out to look, but did not want to seem paranoid. Maybe nothing. Maybe I am seeing trouble where there is none. Tom set the notebook down and stared out the window. 3 entries for the same day, the last one written late at night. Walter had heard something, noticed something, but had second-guessed himself. Had chosen not to investigate, not to make an issue of it. The next entry was dated July 18th, 2 days later. Sheriff Morrison came to the house this morning, asked where I was on the night of July 16th. Told him I was home. He asked if anyone could verify that. I said no, I live alone. He wrote that down, asked if I had seen or heard anything unusual that night. I told him about the truck I heard around midnight. He asked if I could identify it. I said no. He asked if I was sure I had been home all night. I said yes. He left without explaining why he was asking. Learned later that Frank Carver disappeared that night. His truck was found at Hazel Creek, empty, keys in the ignition. No sign of struggle, no note, just gone. People are already talking. I can feel it when I go to town. Tom read the entry 3 times. Walter had told the sheriff about the truck, had provided information that might have been relevant to the investigation, but it had never appeared in any official report, never been followed up on, never been used to point the investigation in any direction except toward Walter himself. The subsequent entries documented the rapid deterioration of Walter's standing in the community. Conversations that stopped when he entered the feed store. Neighbors who no longer waved when he drove past. Small acts of exclusion that accumulated into isolation. July 22nd. Sheriff came back, brought a deputy this time. Searched the property, did not say what they were looking for. Did not find anything because there is nothing to find. Sheriff asked again about my relationship with Frank Carver. I told him the truth. We had disagreements about land, nothing more. He asked if I had ever threatened Frank. I said no. He did not look like he believed me. July 28th. Howard Carver came to my door. First time he has been here since Frank disappeared. He looked at me with such hatred I felt it like heat. He said, "You know what you did?" He said, "My boy is gone because of you." I tried to speak, to tell him I had nothing to do with it. He turned and walked away. Did not want to hear it. August 3rd. Deputy Brennan came by, unofficial. Young man, seems honest, asked if I saw anything unusual the night of July 16th. Told him again about the truck I heard. He wrote it down, said he would include it in his report, asked if I would testify to it if needed. I said yes. Never heard back about it. Tom made a note. Carl Brennan, deputy in 1983. Walter had mentioned him specifically, had identified him as different from the others. Someone who had at least tried to investigate properly. He spent the rest of the morning reading through the investigation records Walter had somehow obtained. They were incomplete, missing pages, but what remained told a clear story. Witness statements from ranch hands who claimed to have seen Walter and Frank arguing the day Frank disappeared. A timeline that placed Walter near Hazel Creek around the time Frank's truck was found, though the timeline was based on speculation rather than evidence. Most significantly, there was no physical evidence. No weapon, no blood, no body, No proof of anything except that Frank Carver had vanished and that Walter Hartford had been involved in a land dispute with him. The investigation had stalled within weeks. The official conclusion, such as it was, appeared in a brief report dated September 1983. Insufficient evidence to proceed with charges. Case remains open pending discovery of new evidence or recovery of remains. But the damage had been done. Walter's name appeared in every report, in every news article, always in the same context. Person of interest, last person known to have argued with the victim. Uncooperative. The language never quite accused, but it suggested, implied, pointed. Conviction without trial, guilt without proof. Tom pushed back from the table, his chest tight with an anger he had not expected. He stood and paced the kitchen, trying to process what he had read, trying to understand how an entire community could decide a man's guilt based on rumor and convenience. The afternoon was half gone. He made a sandwich he barely tasted and carried it outside, needing air, needing distance from the suffocating weight of those documents. He sat on the porch steps and ate mechanically, watching clouds build in the west, their undersides dark with the promise of rain that might or might not come. His phone rang. James. Tom considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. "Have you thought any more about selling?" James asked without preamble. Tom was quiet for a moment. "I've been reading Grandpa's papers, the ones I found in the corn crib." James sighed. "Tom, let it go. Whatever happened back then, it is over." "He was innocent," Tom said. The words came out harder than he intended. He was framed, or at the very least, he was blamed for something he did not do, and nobody cared about the truth. "What difference does it make now?" James asked, his voice carrying a weariness that sounded decades old. "He is dead. The man who disappeared is dead or gone. Everyone from back then is dying off. You cannot change any of it." Tom watched the clouds. "Maybe I cannot change it, but I can know what happened. I can understand it." "Why?" James asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "What good does understanding do?" "It gives him back his dignity," Tom said quietly. James was silent for a long time. Then, so quietly Tom almost missed it. "Does it give us back the years we lost? Does it undo the fact that we abandoned him when he needed us?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. "I have to go," James said finally, and ended the call. Tom sat in the silence that followed, the phone still in his hand. He thought about the argument 33 years ago, about the things he had said that could not be unsaid, about the door he had closed that had never reopened. "You cannot fight the world, Tom." Walter's voice in his memory, quiet and resigned. "Why not?" His own voice, young and angry. "Why do not you?" "Because the world is bigger than me, and fighting proves nothing." Tom had interpreted that as weakness then. Cowardice. The unwillingness of an old man to stand up for himself. But now, sitting on the porch of the house where Walter had lived alone for decades, he understood it differently. Walter had not been afraid to fight. He had been exhausted by it. He had learned that some battles were lost before they began, that some narratives, once established, could not be challenged from within. The system had decided his guilt. Fighting it would only confirm what people already believed. So he had chosen endurance over resistance, survival over vindication. He had preserved the truth in the only way available to him, hidden it where it might wait decades if necessary, and trusted that someday someone would care enough to look. Tom stood and walked to the corn crib. The structure had become a fixed point in his thinking, an anchor. He studied it in the changing light, noting the care in its construction, the repairs that showed Walter's attention over years. This building had been more than agricultural storage. It had been a safe, a vault, a testament. He spent the remainder of the afternoon continuing the work of clearing it, his hands falling into the rhythm of lift and stack. Lift, stack. The physical labor settled something in him, gave his body a task while his mind continued to process the morning's reading. 3 feet deeper into the packed corn, he found another bundle, his third discovery. He had begun to expect them now, to understand that Walter had layered his evidence throughout the crib, creating multiple caches in case some were found and destroyed. This bundle contained photographs, older than the others, more fragile, images of fence lines and property markers. Several showed boot prints in soil, tire tracks crossing a field. Walter had documented the boundary area in the days immediately following Frank's disappearance, preserving evidence that suggested activity where there should have been none. One photograph showed 2 men at a distance, too far away for their faces to be clear. A truck was visible in the background, and Walter had marked the photo with a date and time. July 16, 1983, approximately 11 p.m., viewed from my North 40, looking toward Carver property line. Tom studied the image under better light inside the house. The truck in the background was distinctive, larger than a standard pickup, the kind used for ranch work. He could not make out the faces of the men, but their postures suggested urgency, perhaps argument. Walter had been watching, had documented, had tried to preserve proof of something he could not fully explain, but knew was significant. Among the photos was one that struck Tom with unexpected force. Two men standing together in daylight, younger versions of themselves, their expressions neutral but not unfriendly. He recognized Walter from the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. The other man was unfamiliar, but the writing on the back identified him. Frank Carver and me, 1978, before everything changed. Tom stared at the photograph for a long time. These two men had not been enemies. They had been neighbors. They had stood together in a field, their land touching, their lives intersecting in the unremarkable way of rural people who shared boundaries and weather and the common struggle of farming. What had happened between 1978 and 1983 to transform that neutral coexistence into a conflict that ended with one man dead and the other blamed? The answer, Tom was beginning to suspect, had less to do with Walter and Frank than with forces that had used them both. That evening, he made a decision. The documents alone could not tell him everything. He needed to talk to people who had been there, who remembered events from perspectives other than Walter's careful notes. He needed to hear the story as others had lived it. He started the next morning by driving to the county library. It was a small building on a side street, brick and glass, newer than most structures in Cedar Ridge. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the smell of books and carpet and the faint chemical scent of copier toner. The woman at the circulation desk looked up as he entered. She was perhaps late 40s, with dark hair pulled back and glasses that magnified eyes that seemed used to close reading. Her name tag identified her as Margaret Chen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professionally pleasant. Tom approached the desk. "I am looking for historical records, old newspapers specifically, from the 1980s. "We have microfilm," she said, "and some digitized archives, though coverage is incomplete. What dates are you interested in?" "Summer of 1983, Tom said. "July through September." Something shifted in her expression. Not obvious, but there. A flicker of recognition or perhaps foreknowledge. She stood and gestured for him to follow. The archives were in a back room, quiet and windowless. She showed him how to use the microfilm reader, her instructions clear and patient. When she had finished, she paused, her hand resting on the machine. "You are researching the Carver disappearance," she said, not a question. Tom met her eyes. "I am." She nodded slowly. "Your grandfather came here every Tuesday for years. He would sit right where you are sitting and read through old newspapers. He never checked anything out, never asked for help, just read quietly and left. I always wondered what he was looking for." "Did you ever ask him?" Tom said. "Once," she replied. "I asked if he was researching something. He looked at me for a long moment, then said he was just keeping up. At the time, I believed him. Now I am not sure I do." "What do you think he was doing?" Tom asked. She considered the question. "I think he was documenting how his own conviction happened, watching them write the story, seeing himself transformed into someone he was not, one article at a time." She left him alone with the machine and the boxes of microfilm. Tom worked methodically, scrolling through editions of the Cedar Ridge Chronicle, the county's weekly newspaper. The coverage began in late July 1983 with a front-page story. "Local farmer missing. Frank Carver failed to return home." The article was brief, factual. It reported the discovery of Carver's truck at Hazel Creek, noted the ongoing search, mentioned that foul play had not been ruled out. Walter's name did not appear. But by the following week's edition, the tone had changed. Search continues for missing farmer. Questions linger about property dispute. Now Walter was mentioned, not accused directly but present in the narrative. Sources say Carver and neighbor Walter Hartford had disagreed over land boundaries. Hartford, who owns adjacent property, was questioned by investigators. The language was careful, legalistic, but the implication was clear. Week after week, the story evolved. Or rather, it calcified. No new information emerged, no developments were reported. But Walter's name appeared with increasing frequency, always in the same context, always carrying the same suggestion. Investigation continues, but no charges filed. Walter Hartford, whose property adjoins Carver land, remains a person of interest. Community struggles with unanswered questions. Many residents believe they know what happened, but say evidence is lacking. By September, coverage had dwindled to brief mentions buried in later pages. The community had moved on, having reached its own conclusion without waiting for official confirmation. Tom scrolled back through the articles, studying them not for information but for pattern. What struck him was not what the paper reported, but what it failed to report. No mention of Walter's testimony about the truck he heard, no discussion of the land pressure from Howard Carver Sr., no investigation into who might have benefited from Frank's disappearance. Just a steady drumbeat of insinuation that had convicted Walter in the court of public opinion, while official channels remained carefully neutral. He printed the relevant articles, paying the small fee at the circulation desk. Margaret Chen processed his payment, then looked at him directly. "I was young when all that happened," she said, "barely out of high school, but I remember the feeling in town. People wanted an answer. Your grandfather was an easy answer. Kept to himself, did not have allies. When something bad happens and no one knows why, people look for someone to blame. Your grandfather was available." "You think he was innocent?" Tom said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think the investigation stopped when it became inconvenient to continue. That is not the same as justice." He thanked her and left, the printed articles in a folder under his arm. The morning was bright and warm, the sky clear. He sat in his truck for several minutes, organizing his thoughts, considering his next move. Carl Brennan, the deputy who had taken Walter's statement about the truck, who had seemed, in Walter's brief mention, different from the others, more interested in truth than convenience. Tom drove to the VFW hall on the edge of town. It was early afternoon, the parking lot nearly empty. Inside, the air was dim and cool, smelling of beer and old carpet. A few men sat scattered throughout, watching a baseball game on a television mounted in the corner. He approached the bar, asked the man behind it if he knew Carl Brennan. The bartender, heavy-set and gray-bearded, jerked his thumb toward a corner booth without looking away from the television. Carl was there alone, nursing a beer and staring at a weather channel on a second television that no one else seemed to be watching. He was in his early 70s, lean and weathered, with the careful movements of a man who had learned to husband his energy. Tom approached slowly. "Mr. Brennan?" The old man looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. "I know who you are," he said. "Saw you at the hardware store a couple days ago. You are the Hartford grandson." Tom nodded. "I was hoping I could talk to you." Carl studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the seat across from him. "Buy me a beer and I will tell you what I can." Tom got 2 beers from the bar and returned to the booth. They sat in silence for a moment, Carl drinking slowly, Tom waiting. Finally, Carl spoke. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said without preamble. "I knew it then. I know it now. But I was a coward." The words hung between them, blunt and undefended. "I was 29 years old," Carl continued. "Had a wife, a baby on the way. Sheriff Morrison was my boss. When he told me to let the Carver case go cold, I let it go. I wanted to keep my job. I wanted to keep my family safe. So I did what I was told." Tom kept his voice level. "What did you know?" Carl took another drink, his eyes distant. "Frank Carver came to me 3 days before he disappeared. Said he was scared. Said he had seen Howard Carver Sr. and 2 ranch hands surveying your grandfather's land at night, moving boundary markers. Frank told me his father had threatened him. Said if Frank did not keep quiet about what he had seen, he would regret it." Tom felt something cold settle in his chest. "What did you do?" "I told Frank I would investigate," Carl said quietly. "But before I could, Frank was gone. Truck found at the creek, no body. Howard Carver Sr. came to the sheriff's office 2 days later with 2 witnesses, ranch hands. They said they had seen your grandfather arguing with Frank the day he vanished. Said it looked heated." "Were there other witnesses?" Tom asked. Carl shook his head. "Just those 2. And they both worked for Howard Carver. But Sheriff Morrison took their statements as gospel. Told me to focus the investigation on your grandfather." I tried to argue. Told him we should look at Howard Carver too, should follow up on what Frank had said about the boundary markers. Sheriff shut me down. Said Howard Carver was a respected member of the community. Said your grandfather was a loner who nobody liked. Said we needed to go where the evidence pointed. "But there was no evidence," Tom said. "Exactly," Carl replied. No body, no weapon, no physical proof of anything. Just witness statements from men on Carver's payroll and a lot of assumption. I wrote my report honestly, said there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone. The sheriff filed it and told me to stop wasting time. Case went cold. Tom was quiet, processing. You said you were a coward. What did you mean? Carl finished his beer and set the glass down carefully. 2 years after Frank disappeared, I found something. Land records showing the 60 acres your grandfather lost in the boundary resurvey had been transferred to Howard Carver Sr. through some questionable paperwork. Signatures that did not quite match. Dates that did not add up. I brought it to the district attorney. He looked at it for about 5 minutes, then handed it back. He said it was ancient history. Told me to move on. And you did, Tom said. Carl met his eyes. I did not. I kept pushing, quietly, asking questions, suggesting to the sheriff that maybe we should take another look. Then one night someone ran my wife off the road. She survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down. Next morning I found a note on my windshield. Drop it or she dies next time. Jesus, Tom breathed. I dropped it, Carl said flatly. Retired early, moved my wife to Greeley for better medical care. Spent the next 40 years taking care of her and trying to live with myself. She died 3 years ago. Cancer. I moved back here because I did not know where else to go. The television continued its weather report in the background. Neither man looked at it. Why are you telling me this? Tom asked. Because you are asking the questions I should have kept asking, Carl said. Because your grandfather lived 40 years with people believing he was a killer. Because that was my fault as much as anyone's. And because I am 72 years old and I would like to die with a little less weight on my conscience. Tom pulled out the photograph he had found, the one showing the two distant figures and the truck. He slid it across the table. My grandfather took this the night Frank disappeared. Can you tell me anything about it? Carl studied the photograph, his expression hardening. That truck looks like the kind Howard Carver used on his ranch. Big flatbed, extended cab. And those men, he paused, then looked up at Tom. Your grandfather told me about this. Said he heard a truck that night, saw lights near the property line. I put it in my report. Sheriff removed it. Said your grandfather was trying to deflect blame. Another piece of evidence suppressed, Tom said. Carl nodded. There were probably others. Sheriff Morrison died in 2003. Took whatever he knew with him. They sat in silence for a while. Tom felt the accumulated weight of all these small betrayals, these moments when truth had been set aside for convenience or fear or self-interest. What happened to the physical case files? Tom asked. Should be in county storage, Carl said. But I would not count on finding much. Things have a way of disappearing when they are inconvenient. Do you still have access? Carl smiled grimly. I kept my key when I retired. Never returned it. Figured someday I might need it. Could you show me where they are? Carl considered this. I could. But what are you planning to do with whatever you find? Tom was honest. I do not know yet. But my grandfather spent 4 decades preserving evidence nobody wanted to see. I owe it to him to see it. Carl finished his beer and stood, his movements careful. Come on then. Storage unit is on the edge of town. We can go now if you want. They drove separately, Tom following Carl's old sedan through Cedar Ridge and out to a facility of metal buildings surrounded by chain link fence. Carl had a key to the gate and another to one of the units. Inside were cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each labeled with case numbers and dates. Carl knew exactly where to look. He pulled down a box marked Carver, Francis, 1983, and set it on a folding table someone had left there. I have not looked at this in 30 years, he said, opening it. Inside were folders, photographs, evidence logs. Tom and Carl went through everything carefully, methodically. Most of it Tom had already seen in some form in Walter's collection, but there were a few items that were new. A photograph from the scene where Frank's truck was found. In the mud near the driver's door, a clear boot print. Beside it, a ruler for scale and a photographer's notation. Carl pointed to it. That boot print, he said quietly. I remember taking that photo. Distinctive pattern, custom-made boots, expensive. I noted in my report that we should try to match it. Sheriff told me it was probably Frank's own boot from when he got out of the truck. I said we should verify that. He said there were more important leads to follow. Was it ever matched? Tom asked. Carl shook his head. Far as I know, no one ever tried. But I can tell you this. I saw Howard Carver Sr. wearing boots with that exact pattern. He had them custom made, special order from some company in Texas. Only pair like it in the county. Tom photographed the image with his phone. Keep looking. Further in the box, they found a toxicology report, water samples taken from Walter's property. Carl frowned as he read it. This was never in the official file, he said. Someone must have pulled it, or tried to. What does it show? Tom asked. Abnormal chemical content in your grandfather's livestock water tank. Consistent with sedatives used on cattle, the kind of thing that would make animals sick, make a farmer seem negligent. The report is dated August 1983, month after Frank disappeared. Someone was trying to make Grandpa look incompetent, Tom said. Or trying to give him more problems, Carl replied. Keep him off balance. Howard Carver's ranch used these exact sedatives. Standard practice for large-scale cattle operations. They photographed everything, careful not to remove anything that might be needed later. When they had finished, Carl closed the box and returned it to its place. Outside in the fading afternoon light, they stood by their vehicles. Carl looked old and tired, but also lighter somehow, as if confession had removed some portion of weight. What will you do now? He asked. Tom considered. I need to understand the full picture. The land transfer, how it was done, who benefited. Margaret Chen at the library might help with that, Carl said. She has access to property records, and she is good at finding things people do not want found. Tom extended his hand. Thank you for this, for telling me, for showing me. Carl shook it, his grip still strong. Your grandfather deserved better than he got. We all failed him. If you could set any of it right, even this late, that is worth doing. Tom drove back to the farm through the long light of early evening. His mind was full of fragments that were beginning to assemble into a coherent whole. Not proof yet, not enough to overturn 40 years of accepted narrative, but enough to suggest that the narrative had been carefully constructed by people who had something to hide. At the farm, he returned to the corn crib and continued the work of clearing it. The physical labor helped him think, helped him process what he had learned. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, his hands found another bundle buried deep in the corn. This one contained letters, copies of correspondence Walter had sent over the years to various authorities, State Attorney General, FBI, congressional representatives. Each letter carefully worded, presenting evidence, requesting investigation. And with each letter, a notation indicating that no response had been received, or that the response had been a form letter thanking him for his concern. Walter had tried, had reached out again and again to official channels, seeking someone who would listen, who would care about truth, and had been met with silence or dismissal. At the bottom of the bundle was an envelope addressed in Walter's handwriting, but never sent. The flap was unsealed. Inside, a letter addressed to Tom. Grandson, I do not blame you for leaving. This place was poisoned by what they believe about me, by what they chose to believe when belief was easier than investigation. I hope wherever you went, you found something better, something clean. If someday you come back and find this, know that I never stopped being your grandfather, even when the world said I was something worse. The truth is here if you want it. If you do not, I will understand that too. Either way, you were loved, you are loved, even in silence. Tom stood in the dimming light, the letter trembling in his hands. Around him, the farm stretched quiet and vast. Above, stars were beginning to appear in a sky that held the last pale wash of day. For the first time since receiving news of Walter's death, Tom allowed himself to cry. Not the held-back tears of shock or loss, but a deeper grief for time wasted, for love unexpressed, for the years of silence that had stood between them like a wall neither had known how to breach. He cried for his grandfather, who had endured 4 decades of unearned shame with dignity and patience. He cried for himself, for the judgment he had carried without questioning, for the abandonment he could never undo. When the tears finally stopped, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, close to his heart. The work was not finished. The corn crib still held its secrets. The truth still waited to be assembled and understood. But something had shifted. He was no longer clearing the crib to prepare for sale. He was excavating memory, recovering what had been buried, bringing to light what Walter had preserved against the day when someone would care enough to look. Tomorrow he would return to town, would talk to Margaret Chen about property records, would continue to piece together the story from fragments and careful documentation, would do what Walter had not been able to do, challenge the narrative that had defined and confined him. The night settled fully over the farm. Tom stood before the corn crib, its dark shape solid against the stars, and made a silent promise to the man who had built it, maintained it, filled it with truth that the world had not wanted to hear. "I am listening now," he said into the darkness. "I am listening, and I will not stop until everyone hears what you tried to say." The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the smell of dust and growing things, the particular scent of this land that had been in his family for 3 generations. It was a smell he had forgotten during his years away, but which returned to him now with the force of recovered memory. Walter had lived close to this land, had known its moods and demands, had given himself to it without reservation. And the land had witnessed what happened to him, had held the truth in its soil while people chose to believe lies. Tom walked the perimeter of the corn crib one more time, his hand trailing along the weathered boards. In the darkness, he could feel the care that had gone into its construction. This was not just a building, it was a statement of faith. Faith that truth mattered. Faith that someday someone would look. Inside the house, he made coffee and settled at the kitchen table. The documents lay where he had left them, organized into chronological stacks that told a story when read in sequence. He picked up Walter's notebook again. September 83. Investigation officially suspended. Sheriff says without a body or physical evidence, there is nothing more to pursue. Everyone believes I am guilty. The lack of charges changes nothing. Went to town today for supplies. Hardware store owner served me, but would not meet my eyes. This is my life now. October 1983. Property tax notice arrived. Also notice of boundary survey ordered by county. I objected in writing. Objection noted, but survey will proceed. They will take the land they always wanted, and I have no way to stop it. November 1983. Survey completed. The line has moved. 60 acres that were mine are now disputed territory. Howard Carver has already filed claim. I have no allies on the commission. He sits on it himself. Tom set the notebook down. The systematic nature of it was what struck him most. This had not been a crime of passion. This had been calculated seizure, dressed up in legal procedure, carried out over months by people who knew exactly what they were doing. He found more letters in another bundle. Letters Walter had written but never sent, addressed to people who had once been friends. One, addressed to a man named Robert Mills, was particularly painful to read. "Robert, we worked together on the church building committee for 5 years. After Frank disappeared, you stopped speaking to me. I want you to know that I did not hurt Frank Carver. I want you to know that your silence hurt me more than any accusation. If you believed I was capable of murder, you should have confronted me. If you did not believe it, you should have stood beside me. Your neutrality was a choice, and it condemned me as surely as any verdict." The letter was dated 1980. Walter had kept it, along with dozens of others like it. Testimonies to friendships destroyed, to trust betrayed. Tom understood something then. Walter had not been destroyed by his enemies. He had been destroyed by the people who claimed to be neutral, who had simply stopped defending him, who had allowed the narrative to harden without challenge. That was the real crime. He thought about his own departure, how he had left at 19, angry and ashamed, never questioning the story everyone believed. He had not accused Walter directly, but he had not defended him either. He had chosen distance, chosen silence. He had been part of the problem. The night deepened. Tom continued reading, making notes, photographing documents with his phone, creating backups, preserving what Walter had preserved. Sometime past midnight, exhaustion finally overtook him. He gathered the documents carefully, returned them to their bundles, placed them in a safe location. Then he climbed the stairs and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep. When he woke, pale light was already filtering through the curtains. He rose and went downstairs, made coffee, ate bread and butter standing at the counter, looked out the window at the corn crib, which stood patient and solid in the early light. Today he would go back to town, would talk to Margaret Chen, would begin the next phase. But for this moment, standing in his grandfather's kitchen with coffee warming his hands, he allowed himself to simply be present. Walter Hartford had been innocent, had lived 40 years blamed for something he did not do, and Tom was going to prove it. Not for revenge, not even primarily for justice, but for dignity, for the simple acknowledgement that Walter Hartford had been a good man who deserved better than the world had given him. The sun climbed higher, light filled the kitchen. Tom finished his coffee, washed the cup, set it in the drainer to dry. Outside, the land waited. The corn crib waited. The truth waited. He was ready to continue. Morning brought clarity, or visitimi us neori, or at least the illusion of it. Tom drove to the library as soon as it opened, arriving before the parking lot had filled, before the day had fully committed to its purpose. The building stood quiet in the early light, its glass doors reflecting clouds that moved slowly across a sky the color of old pewter. Margaret Chen was already at her desk, surrounded by books that needed shelving, a computer screen glowing with what looked like catalog entries. She looked up as Tom entered, and something in her expression suggested she had been expecting him. "I need help," he said without preamble, "with property records, land transfers from the 1980s. She closed the program she had been working on and stood. "Follow me." The records room was in the basement, accessed by stairs that creaked beneath their weight. The air down here was cooler, drier, carrying the particular smell of old paper and preservation. Row after row of filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with dates and document types. Margaret moved through them with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning their geography. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, pulling open a drawer. "The 60 acres my grandfather lost," Tom said. "I need to see how the transfer happened. Who signed what? When the survey was done? Everything." She nodded and began pulling files, setting them on a table that looked like it had been placed there specifically for this kind of archaeology. Tax records, survey documents, deeds and titles, transfer paperwork, chain of ownership going back decades. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, Margaret occasionally pointing out relevant sections, Tom photographing pages, making notes in his growing collection of observations. The story that emerged was damning in its bureaucratic precision. The original survey from 1965 clearly established the boundary. Walter Hartford owned the disputed 60 acres without question. Then in November 1983, a new survey was commissioned by the county. The surveyor's name was unfamiliar, not the man who had done the original work. This new survey moved the line significantly, reclassifying the 60 acres as part of the adjacent property. Tom studied the signatures. "Look at this," he said, pointing. Margaret leaned in. The surveyor's signature appeared twice, once on the preliminary report and again on the final document. But the handwriting was subtly different. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen. Similar enough to pass casual inspection, different enough to suggest two different hands. "Someone forged this," Margaret said quietly. "Or the surveyor was pressured to sign documents he did not personally verify," Tom replied. They continued reading. The transfer of title from disputed territory to Howard Carver Sr. happened with remarkable speed. Filed in December 1983, approved by the County Commission in January 1984. The vote was recorded. 4 in favor, 1 abstention. Howard Carver Sr. had recused himself from the vote, a gesture toward propriety that changed nothing about the outcome. The dissenting voice belonged to a councilwoman named Dorothy Hendricks. Her written objection was brief but pointed. Insufficient documentation, irregular procedure, request formal investigation before approval. Her request had been noted and ignored. Tom photographed everything, his phone filling with images that told the story of systematic theft dressed in legal language. When they had finished, Margaret helped him return the files to their proper places, each folder sliding back into its designated position. Upstairs in the main library, she made coffee in a small break room, and they sat at a table away from the circulation desk. The library was still quiet, just a few early patrons browsing shelves, their movements slow and contemplative. "What will you do with this?" Margaret asked. Tom wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "I do not know yet. It is evidence of fraud, but it happened 40 years ago. Everyone involved is probably dead." "Howard Carver Jr. is not dead," Margaret said. "He inherited all of his father's land holdings, including those 60 acres. If the transfer was fraudulent, he built his wealth on stolen property." Tom had not thought of it in quite those terms. The implications were significant. Not just historical injustice, but ongoing benefit from crime. "Do you know anyone who might remember the details?" Tom asked. "Someone who was there when this happened?" "Pastor Mills," Margaret said immediately. "David Mills, he was the minister at Cedar Ridge Community Church back then. Young pastor, fresh out of seminary. He knew everyone, heard things people told him in confidence. He is retired now, lives in that little house behind the church. If anyone can give you context, it would be him. Tom finished his coffee and thanked her. Outside, the day had warmed, clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of blue. He drove the short distance to the church, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple, the kind of structure that had stood in small towns across America for generations. The house behind it was smaller still, tidy and well-maintained, with a garden that showed recent attention. Tom knocked and waited, hearing movement inside, slow and careful. The man who opened the door was in his 70s, tall and lean, with white hair and eyes that carried the particular clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. He studied Tom for a moment, then smiled. "You are Walter Hartford's grandson," he said. "I can see it in your face." Tom nodded. "I am hoping you might talk to me about what happened, about my grandfather." Pastor Mills stepped back, holding the door wide. "I have been expecting someone to ask. Come in." The interior was simple, comfortable in the way of a man who lived alone, but had not surrendered to disorder. Books lined the walls, theology and history and poetry. A worn armchair sat by the window, a Bible and reading glasses on the side table. They sat across from each other, and Pastor Mills folded his hands in his lap, his posture suggesting patience and attention. "Your grandfather," he began, "came to our church every Sunday until Frank Carver disappeared. He sat in the same pew, fourth row on the left. He participated in the life of the congregation. He was not warm exactly, but he was present, reliable. After Frank vanished, people made him unwelcome. Not explicitly, no one told him to leave, but the seats around him stayed empty. Conversations stopped when he approached. People found reasons to look away. He stopped coming after about a month. I visited him at the farm, asked why. He said he could pray at home, that he did not need a congregation that prayed he would confess to something he did not do." "Did you believe him?" Tom asked. "That he was innocent?" Pastor Mills was quiet for a long moment. "I believed he was human, capable of anger certainly, but murder, it did not fit what I knew of him. But I also believed in my congregation. Good people, faithful people. How could they all be wrong?" He paused, his gaze distant. "It took me years to understand that good people can do terrible things through collective silence. We did not accuse Walter Hartford. We just stopped defending him. We let suspicion settle and harden. That was enough." Tom felt something shift in his chest. This was the first person he had spoken to who acknowledged the failure directly, who named it without excuse. "Did you ever confront the congregation about it?" Tom asked. "Once," Pastor Mills said, "from the pulpit, a year after Frank disappeared. I preached on bearing false witness, on the sin of gossip and assumption. I did not name names, but everyone knew what I meant. After the service, 3 families told me they were looking for a new church. The board of elders suggested I focus on more uplifting messages. I stayed another 5 years, then took a position elsewhere. I have always felt I should have done more, should have stood beside your grandfather publicly, even if it cost me my position. But I was young, I had a family, I chose safety." The confession hung between them, honest and painful. "There is something else you should know," Pastor Mills continued. "Frank Carver came to see me the week before he disappeared. He was troubled, said his father was pressuring him about the land dispute with your grandfather. Howard Carver Sr. wanted Frank to push harder, to take what Howard believed was rightfully theirs. Frank did not want the conflict. He told me he was afraid of his father, afraid of what Howard might do if Frank did not comply. I told Frank to stand firm, to trust in what was right. I thought I was giving good counsel. After he vanished, I wondered if my advice had gotten him killed." Tom leaned forward. "Did you tell this to the sheriff?" "I tried," Pastor Mills said. "Sheriff Morrison came to see me as part of the investigation. I told him about Frank's visit, about his fear of his father. The sheriff wrote it down, thanked me for my time, and left. It never appeared in any report. When I asked about it later, he said it was not relevant, that Frank and his father had normal disagreements like any family." "Another piece of evidence ignored," Tom said. Pastor Mills nodded. "I have lived with that knowledge for 40 years. When I heard Walter had died, I wondered if the truth would die with him. I'm glad someone is finally asking questions." "Do you know where Frank Carver's widow is?" Tom asked. "Patricia, is she still alive?" "She moved to Denver years ago," Pastor Mills said. "To a retirement community, I believe. She wanted distance from Cedar Ridge, from the memories. I have an address somewhere. Let me look." He rose slowly and went to a desk in the corner, rifling through a drawer. He returned with a slide of paper, an address written in careful script. She may not want to talk, he warned. This has been buried a long time. Tom took the address. I have to try. Before he left, Pastor Mills walked him to the door and placed a hand on his shoulder. What you are doing is right. It is also difficult and lonely. Remember that truth is not always welcomed, even when it is proven. People prefer their settled narratives. Be prepared for resistance. Tom drove back to this farm with the address in his pocket, in a growing sense that he was approaching a threshold he could not cross back over. The afternoon was spent organizing his evidence, creating a timeline that laid out the case as clearly as he could make it. Documents, photographs, witness statements. The systematic dismantling of Walter Hartford's life and the equally systematic theft of his land. By evening, he had something that looked coherent. Not proof in the legal sense, perhaps, but a compelling argument that demanded answers. He called the number Pastor Mills had provided for Patricia Carver. A woman answered, her voice elderly and cautious. This is Tom Hartford, he said. Walter Hartford's grandson. I am calling about Frank, about what happened to him. There was a long silence, then quietly I wondered if anyone would ever ask. They agreed to meet the following day. Patricia Carver lived in a modest retirement community on the outskirts of Denver, a collection of low buildings arranged around courtyards with careful landscaping. Tom found her apartment and knocked, his stomach tight with anticipation. The woman who opened the door was in her mid-80s, small and delicate, with white hair and eyes that still carried sharpness. She invited him in, gestured to a chair, and sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap. I read about your grandfather's death in the paper, she said. I almost called you then, but I did not know what to say after so many years of saying nothing. What can you tell me about Frank? Tom asked gently. Patricia looked toward the window, her gaze distant. Frank was a good man, gentle. He wanted to farm, to live quietly. He was not ambitious like his father. Howard Carver Sr. was a force, demanding, controlling. He had built an empire from nothing and expected everyone around him to share his drive. The land dispute with your grandfather troubled Frank. He did not care about those 60 acres, but Howard cared. He saw it as a matter of pride, of power. He pushed Frank to be more aggressive, to assert their claim. Frank resisted. She paused, gathering herself. The night Frank disappeared, he came home from the town council meeting upset. Said Howard had cornered him afterward. Told Frank he had embarrassed him, that the dispute needed to be settled once and for all. Frank said no, that he would not push your grandfather any harder. They argued. Howard said something about taking care of it himself. Frank left angry, said he needed to drive around to cool off. That was the last time I saw him. Tom waited, letting her continue at her own pace. When the sheriff questioned me, I told him about the argument with Howard. He asked if Frank had enemies, if he seemed suicidal. I said no. I said he seemed frightened of his father. The sheriff closed his notebook. Never wrote it down. When I asked later about it, he said family arguments were not evidence of anything. 2 weeks after Frank vanished, Howard Carver Sr. came to my house. He was different, subdued. He said he would take care of everything. The mortgage, the bills, a trust fund for me and Howard Jr. He said it was grief support. It felt like silence money. Did you accept it? Tom asked. She met his eyes. I did. I was a widow with a young son and no income. I took the money and I kept quiet about my suspicions. I have lived with that shame ever since. She stood and went to a closet, returning with a box. Inside were Frank's personal effects, papers, photographs, and at the bottom, a small journal. This was Frank's, she said. He wrote in it sometimes. I kept it all these years. Never showed it to anyone. The last entry was the day before he disappeared. I think you should read it. Tom opened the journal to the final page. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. July 15th, 1983. Father came to the house again. Angrier this time. Says I am weak for not pressing the land issue with Hartford. Says Hartford is making him look foolish. Told me that tomorrow at the council meeting, I need to demand action, or he will. I asked what he meant. He smiled that way he does when he has decided something. Patricia says I should stand up to him. But you do not stand up to Howard Carver. You survive him. I think tomorrow's meeting will go badly. If anything happens to me, I want someone to know. I love Patricia. I never wanted this fight, and I do not trust what my father might do. Tom read it twice, his hands trembling slightly. This was prophetic testimony. Frank Carver had been afraid of his own father, had documented that fear the day before he vanished. "Can I take this?" Tom asked. "Make copies?" Patricia nodded. "Take the original. I do not want it anymore. It has haunted me long enough. If it can help prove what happened, then it should be used." Tom thanked her and stood to leave. At the door, Patricia touched his arm. "Your grandfather did not kill my husband," she said. "I knew that then. I know it now. I am sorry I never said it publicly. I am sorry I let fear silence me." "You are saying it now," Tom replied. "That is what matters." He drove back to Cedar Ridge with Frank's journal in the seat beside him, feeling the weight of it, the significance. This was not Walter's documentation of injustice. This was the victim's own words, pointing toward the truth that had been suppressed. Back at the farm, he added the journal to his growing collection of evidence. The case was building layer upon layer, but he still lacked the physical proof that would make it undeniable. Testimony and documents could be disputed. He needed something concrete. The answer, he suspected, lay in the corn crib. He returned to it that evening, working by the light of a portable lamp he had set up inside. The deeper he went into the packed corn, the more intentional the arrangement became. Walter had not just hidden evidence. He had created a system, a careful archive that revealed itself gradually to anyone patient enough to excavate it. Near the very bottom, in the corner farthest from the door, his hands struck something different. Not a bundle this time. Something solid, metallic. He cleared away the surrounding corn carefully, revealing a metal box about the size of a shoebox, its surface rusted but intact. The lid resisted at first, then gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Inside, protected by layers of old cloth, were items that made Tom's breath catch. A metal button, tarnished but still legible, engraved with initials. HCS, Howard Carver Sr., the kind of button used on expensive ranch jackets. Custom-made, distinctive. Fabric scraps, degraded by time but still identifiable as denim. A small notebook, water-damaged, its pages stuck together but partially legible. And a note from Walter written on paper that had yellowed but remained readable. Found these items buried on the boundary line, August 1983, 1 month after Frank disappeared. Dug quietly at night, marked the location, recovered them before anyone else could. The button is Howard Carver Sr.'s. I have seen him wear jackets with these buttons. The notebook appears to be Frank's. Pages are damaged, but some writing visible. I debated showing this to the sheriff. Knew he would not believe me, kept it in case someday it would matter. Tom carefully separated the pages of the small notebook, using a knife to gently pry them apart. Most were illegible, ink blurred beyond recognition. But a few fragments remained readable. Words and partial sentences in Frank Carver's handwriting. "Father insists," one fragment read. "Will not let it go," another said. "Scared what he will," the sentence cutting off there, the rest lost to water damage. "If I am gone, check the boundary," he buried. The final visible words. Tom sat back on his heels, the box and its contents before him. This was it. Physical evidence linking Howard Carver Sr. to the boundary line at the time of Frank's disappearance. Evidence that Walter had found and preserved, that had waited 40 years in the darkness of the corn crib for someone to discover. He photographed everything, then carefully repacked the box and brought it inside. Tomorrow he would show it to Carl Brennan, would document it properly. But tonight he needed to think about what came next. The evidence was substantial now. Documents, witness testimony, physical artifacts. Together they told a story that challenged the accepted narrative. But releasing this information would have consequences. For Howard Carver Jr., who had built his life on land acquired through fraud and possibly murder. For the community, which would have to confront its collective failure. For Tom himself, who would become the center of attention and scrutiny. He thought about Walter, who had gathered this same evidence, who had reached the same threshold, and who had chosen preservation over confrontation, had chosen to wait, to trust that someday the truth would matter enough for someone to fight for it. That someone was Tom. He could not be anyone else. The decision settled into him gradually, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty. He would go public, would present the evidence, would force the questions that should have been asked 40 years ago. But he would do it carefully, methodically, would build a case that could not be easily dismissed, would find the right people to help him, people whose credibility could not be questioned. He spent the next morning on the phone making calls, sending emails. He contacted the county district attorney's office, requesting a meeting. He reached out to the State Historical Society, which maintained records of land disputes and legal irregularities. He called a civil rights organization that specialized in wrongful conviction cases, explaining that while Walter had never been formally charged, he had been convicted in every way that mattered. By afternoon, he had appointments scheduled, people willing to listen, to review the evidence, to consider whether justice delayed could still be justice delivered. He was in the kitchen, organizing his notes, when he heard a vehicle pull into the drive. Through the window, he saw a truck he recognized, new, expensive, with the Carver Ranch logo on the door. Howard Carver Jr. stepped out, his movements deliberate. He was in his mid-60s, weathered by sun and work, with his father's build, but not his father's hardness. He approached the house slowly, stopping at the porch steps. Tom went out to meet him, his posture neutral, waiting. "Heard you have been asking questions around town," Howard said. "Digging into old business?" "I am trying to understand what happened to my grandfather," Tom replied. "Your grandfather was a suspect in my uncle's disappearance," Howard said. "Everyone knows that." "He was never charged," Tom said. "Never even formally accused. Just blamed." "Because he did it," Howard said. But there was something in his voice that sounded less like conviction and more like recitation. A story he had been told so many times it had become truth through repetition. Tom made a decision. He went inside and returned with copies of the documents, the photographs, Frank's journal. He handed them to Howard. "Read these," Tom said. "Then tell me if you still believe that." Howard took the papers reluctantly, clearly not wanting to but unable to refuse. Tom watched as he read, saw the changes in his expression. Confusion at first, then growing unease. When he reached Frank's journal entry, his face went pale. "This is," Howard started, then stopped. "Where did you get this?" "From Frank's widow," Tom said. "She kept it for 40 years. Your uncle was afraid of your grandfather." "Howard Carver Sr., not mine." Howard looked up, his expression unreadable. "Even if this is true, and I am not saying it is, what do you expect to happen? My grandfather is dead. Your grandfather is dead. What is the point of this?" "The point is truth," Tom said. "The point is that my grandfather lived 40 years blamed for something he did not do. The point is that your family built wealth on land that was stolen. The point is that someone should finally say what actually happened." Howard stared at the papers in his hands, then at Tom. "You will destroy my family's name," he said quietly. "Your family destroyed my grandfather's name," Tom replied. "He never got it back. You have had yours for 60 years. I think you can afford to lose it if it means the truth comes out." Howard handed the papers back and turned to leave. At his truck, pause a moment. "My father was a hard man," he said without turning around. "I knew that, but I never thought." He did not finish. He got in the truck and drove away, dust rising behind him. Tom stood in the yard watching until the truck disappeared. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a heavy recognition that once this became public, there would be no controlling it. The truth would spread in ways he could not predict, would affect people he could not protect. But it had to be done. Walter deserved it. Frank Carver deserved it. And Tom himself deserved to live without the weight of inherited shame. The confrontation with Howard Jr. had left Tom unsettled in ways he had not anticipated. He spent the remainder of the afternoon walking the property, trying to process what he had seen in the other man's face. Not the anger or defensiveness he had expected, but something closer to recognition. The slow, painful dawning of a truth that challenged everything Howard had built his identity upon. Tom understood that feeling. He had experienced it himself over the past weeks as Walter's carefully preserved evidence had dismantled the story Tom had accepted without question for decades. The realization that you have been living inside a lie, that the foundation of your understanding is built on sand, was a violence all its own. He found himself at the boundary line, the place where Walter's land met what had once been Carver property. The fence here was old, sagging in places, wire rusted and posts leaning. He walked along it slowly, trying to imagine this same line 40 years earlier, when the dispute had been active, when men had stood here arguing about ownership and rights. Walter had been right to refuse the sale. This land had been in the Hartford family for 3 generations. To sell it would have been to surrender something more than acreage. It would have been to accept that money mattered more than legacy, that power could simply take what it wanted. But refusing had cost Walter everything. his reputation, his peace, his place in the community. In the end, they had taken the land anyway, just dressed the theft in legal language and county procedure. Tom reached the spot where Walter's note had indicated he found the metal box. The ground here looked no different from any other section of the boundary. Grass and weeds, soil hard-packed by decades of weather. But 40 years ago, something had been buried here. Evidence of a crime. Evidence that Walter had carefully recovered and hidden away. He knelt and touched the earth, feeling its coolness, its solidity. This land remembered. It had witnessed everything. The arguments, the threats, whatever had happened to Frank Carver on that July night in 1983. The land held those memories in its silence, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Standing, Tom looked back toward the farmhouse. From here, he could see the corn crib rising above the other structures, solid and purposeful. It occurred to him that Walter had built more than a storage facility. He had built a monument, a testament to the possibility that truth could survive even when no one wanted to hear it. The evening was coming on, light turning golden and then amber. Tom made his way back slowly, letting the rhythm of walking settle his thoughts. He had set something in motion that could not be stopped now. Howard Carver Jr. knew, would tell others. The story would spread through Cedar Ridge like water finding cracks in stone. Some would believe it. Others would resist, would cling to the narrative they had lived with for 4 decades. There would be anger, defensiveness, denial. But there would also be those who had always doubted, who had carried private misgivings they had never voiced. Those people would feel vindicated, perhaps relieved. And there would be consequences Tom could not predict. Legal ramifications, property disputes, questions about who owed what to whom after so many years. The district attorney might decide there was enough to warrant official inquiry, or might decide, as officials had decided before, that the past was too complicated to disturb. Tom could not control any of that. He could only present what he had found and let it speak for itself. Inside the house, he made dinner from canned soup and bread, eating without tasting, his mind elsewhere. Afterward, he organized the evidence one more time, arranging it in chronological order, creating a narrative flow that would be easy for others to follow. Documents first, establishing the timeline. Then witness statements, adding context and human dimension. Finally, the physical evidence, the undeniable artifacts that tied everything together. It was nearly 9 when he finally called James. His brother answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. Tom spoke for nearly 20 minutes, laying out everything that had happened since they had last talked. The documents Margaret had helped him find, Pastor Mill's testimony, Patricia Carver's painful confession, Frank's journal, the metal box from the corn crib, Howard Jr.'s visit and his visible struggle with what the evidence suggested about his family. James listened without interrupting, and Tom could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could imagine him sitting in whatever room he occupied in St. Louis, processing this avalanche of information. When Tom finished, there was a long silence. Then James spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I was wrong to leave, wrong to never question. I am sorry, Tom." The words landed with unexpected weight. Tom had not realized how much he needed to hear them until they were spoken. "You can still help," Tom said. "I need someone who believes me, someone who can stand beside me when this gets difficult, and it will get difficult." "I will be there," James said. "Whatever you need." "When are you going public with this?" "Soon," Tom said. "I have meetings scheduled with the district attorney's office and a few other agencies. I want to give them a chance to review the evidence before it becomes a media circus. But eventually it will have to go public. This story is too big to stay quiet." "What about the farm?" James asked. "Are you still planning to sell?" Tom had not thought about that in days. The question of selling, which had seemed so straightforward when he first arrived, now felt absurdly complicated. "I do not know," he admitted. "Selling feels wrong now, like abandoning the place again. But staying," he trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Staying means becoming part of Cedar Ridge," James said. "Means living among people who may resent what you have done, even if what you have done is right. That is a hard way to live." "Grandpa did it for 40 years, Tom said quietly. "And it killed him," James replied. "Not physically, maybe, but in every other way that matters." The truth of that sat between them, undeniable and heavy. "I will figure it out," Tom said eventually. "One thing at a time." After they hung up, Tom sat at the kitchen table with the evidence spread before him. He thought about Walter sitting in this same place at this same table, documenting injustice and persecution, writing letters that would never be sent, preserving truth that no one wanted to hear. What had kept him going? What internal resource had Walter drawn on to wake up each morning and continue? Faith, perhaps, or stubbornness, or simply the bone-deep conviction that truth mattered, even when it was powerless. Tom picked up one of the unsent letters, the one addressed to Robert Mills. Reading it again, he was struck by the absence of bitterness. Walter had been hurt by the betrayal of friends, but he had not descended into rage or self-pity. His tone was almost gentle, as if he understood that the people who had abandoned him were themselves victims of a kind of moral cowardice they might not even recognize in themselves. That capacity for understanding, for seeing his persecutors as human even in their failure, was something Tom was not sure he could match. He felt anger on his grandfather's behalf, anger at the sheriff who had suppressed evidence, at the county officials who had rubber-stamped fraud, at the community that had chosen comfortable lies over difficult truth. But anger alone would not serve him in what was coming. He would need Walter's patience, his ability to endure without becoming consumed by bitterness. His faith that truth, once planted, would eventually grow, even if he did not live to see the harvest. Tom stood and moved through the dark house, room to room, touching things that had belonged to Walter. The worn armchair where he had sat to read, the coffee pot he had used every morning, the boots by the door still laced, as if their owner might return at any moment to step into them. These objects were not just possessions. They were evidence of a life lived, of dailiness and routine, of a man who had continued to exist even when the world tried to erase him. There was dignity in that, a quiet heroism that had nothing to do with grand gestures and everything to do with simple persistence. In Walter's bedroom, Tom opened the drawer of the bedside table. Inside, he found what he had somehow known would be there. More journals, not the investigative notebook he had found in the corn crib, but personal diaries, years of them, dating back to before the accusation, chronicling ordinary life. He pulled out the volume from 1983 and carried it downstairs. At the kitchen table under the harsh light of the overhead fixture, he read. The early entries were mundane, weather observations, work completed, brief notes about Tom and James when they had visited as boys. Walter's handwriting was steady, controlled, the entries factual and spare. Then came July. The tone shifted, not dramatically but noticeably. The entries became longer, more detailed. Walter had known something was happening, had felt the ground shifting beneath him. July 17th. Sheriff came again today, brought 2 deputies. They searched the property for 3 hours. I asked what they were looking for. No answer. They found nothing because there is nothing to find. Neighbors watching from the road. I could see them standing there, staring, judging. July 20th. Went to town for supplies. Feed store owner would not look at me, said prices had gone up, tried to charge me more than usual rate. I paid it. No point arguing. Woman at post office asked if I had heard anything about Frank. I said no. She looked at me like I was lying. Maybe she thinks I am. Maybe everyone does. August 1st. Realized today that I have not spoken to another human being in 4 days. The silence is becoming normal. I am learning to live inside it. Perhaps this is what the rest of my life will be. Perhaps I should accept that. Tom read through months and then years, watched as Walter's entries documented not just the investigation and its aftermath, but the slow process of learning to live with exile, the gradual adjustment to isolation, the small victories of making it through another day, another season, another year. What emerged from the pages was not the broken man Tom had imagined, but someone who had found a way to endure with dignity intact. Walter had continued to farm, though on a smaller scale, had maintained the property, though no one saw or appreciated the work, had lived deliberately, purposefully, as if his life still mattered, even though the world had decided otherwise. There was courage in that, a kind of quiet defiance that refused to be erased. Tom read until his eyes burned and exhaustion made the words blur. When he finally closed the journal and climbed the stairs to bed, it was past 2 in the morning. He fell asleep almost immediately, the deep sleep of emotional exhaustion. He dreamed of Walter, not as Tom had last seen him, old and withdrawn, but younger, standing in the field with a hand shading his eyes against the sun, looking towards something on the horizon Tom could not see. In the dream, Walter turned and smiled, a rare expression Tom had almost forgotten, and said something Tom could not quite hear. But the tone was clear. Approval, benediction, permission to do what needed to be done. Tom woke to pale light and the sound of rain against the windows. He lay still for a moment, letting the dream fade but holding on to the feeling it had left, a sense of rightness, of being on a path that, however difficult, was the one he was meant to walk. He rose and dressed and went downstairs, made coffee and stood at the window watching rain fall on the farm. The land needed this. The drought of late summer had left everything parched and desperate. Now water was coming, soaking into soil, feeding roots, preparing the ground for whatever came next. It felt symbolic, though Tom distrusted easy symbolism. Still, there was something fitting about rain falling as he prepared to bring buried truth into light. Washing clean, renewal, the possibility of growth from barren ground. After breakfast, he called Margaret Chen, asked if she could help him prepare the evidence for presentation to official channels. She agreed immediately, said she would come to the farm that afternoon. Next, he called Pastor Mills, asked if he would be willing to write a formal statement about what Frank Carver had told him, about the sheriff's dismissal of that information. The old pastor was quiet for a long moment, then said yes, that he had been waiting 40 years for someone to ask. Finally, Tom called Carl Brennan. The retired deputy had been instrumental in helping Tom understand how the investigation had been compromised. Now Tom needed him to go on record, to state formally what he had told Tom privately. Carl's response was immediate. About time someone held people accountable. I will write down everything I know, everything I should have said years ago. By afternoon, the rain had stopped and Margaret arrived, her car pulling carefully into the muddy drive. She had brought supplies, file folders, labels, a portable scanner. They worked at the kitchen table for hours, organizing everything into a coherent package, creating copies, documenting chain of custody, building a case that could withstand scrutiny. As they worked, they talked. Margaret shared what she remembered of the time when Frank Carver had disappeared, the fear that had moved through the community, the need for an answer that had led people to accept the first plausible explanation they were offered. It is easier to blame someone who is already on the margins, she said, labeling a folder. Your grandfather was quiet. He kept to himself. He did not have allies who would defend him. That made him an easy target. By evening, they had created 3 complete sets of documentation. One for the district attorney, one for state authorities, one for Tom to keep. Margaret helped him draft a cover letter, formal and carefully worded, requesting official review of new evidence in a matter previously considered closed. Before she left, she paused at the door. You are doing the right thing, but prepare yourself. This will not be easy. People will resist. They have lived with their version of events for too long to give it up without a fight. I know, Tom said, but it has to be done. After she drove away, Tom stood on the porch watching the sun break through clouds in the west, light spilling across wet fields. The air smelled of earth and rain and growing things. Clean, promising. He thought about what would happen once he delivered the evidence, the investigations that might be reopened, the questions that would be asked, the disruption to settled narratives and comfortable assumptions. Some would welcome it. Others would fight it with everything they had. But Walter had done the hard part, had gathered the evidence, preserved the truth, endured decades of unjust blame without breaking. Tom's task was simpler, just to speak, to present what Walter had left him, to insist that the truth be acknowledged even if justice was no longer possible. He could do that, would do that, for Walter, for Frank Carver, for himself and James and everyone else who had been shaped by a lie they had never questioned. The light faded gradually, the sky turning from gold to pink to purple. Tom watched until the first stars appeared, pinpricks of light in the deepening dark. Then he went inside, turned on lamps against the night, and sat down to write the final piece, his own statement, his own testimony about what he had found and why it mattered. He wrote until his hand cramped and his back ached, wrote about arriving at the farm intending to sell it quickly, about finding the corn crib maintained when everything else had decayed, about the discovery of Walter's archive and what it had revealed, about the witnesses who had confirmed what the documents suggested, about the physical evidence that tied it all together. He wrote about his own complicity, his decades of silence and distance, His failure to ask questions or seek truth. He owned that, made it part of the record. And he wrote about Walter, not as a victim, though he had been victimized, but as a man of principle who had chosen the truth over comfort, who had preserved evidence because he believed it would eventually matter, who had endured isolation and blame without surrendering his integrity. When he finished, it was past midnight. He printed the statement, signed it, added it to the evidence packets. Everything was ready. Tomorrow he would begin the process of going public, would deliver the evidence to people who had the power to act on it, would speak Walter's truth to a world that had refused to hear it for 40 years. The silence was breaking, finally, irrevocably breaking. Tom walked out to the corn crib one final time. The structure stood empty now, its contents cleared, its purpose fulfilled. He stood inside looking up at the rafters, the spaces where bundles had been hidden, the careful architecture of preservation that Walter had created. "Thank you," he said into the empty space, "for trusting that someone would come, for believing truth was worth saving." The corn crib offered no answer, but Tom felt something shift in his chest. The weight he had been carrying, the accumulated burden of inherited shame and unanswered questions, began to lighten. He was ready. Tomorrow the hard work would begin, but tonight, standing in the structure his grandfather had built and maintained and filled with truth, Tom Hartford felt something he had not felt in years: hope, and the quiet certainty that he was at last doing what needed to be done. The district attorney's office occupied the third floor of the county courthouse, a building that had stood in the center of Cedar Ridge since 1932. Tom climbed the stairs slowly, carrying a leather folder that contained copies of everything he had gathered. Each step felt weighted, significant, as if he were ascending towards something that could not be undone. The receptionist looked up as he entered, young, professional, her expression shifting to careful neutrality when he gave his name. She had been expecting him. The appointment had been made 3 days earlier, after multiple phone calls and a brief explanation that had been met with skepticism barely concealed. District Attorney Patricia Reeves appeared in the doorway of her office within minutes. She was in her early 50s, gray suit, dark hair pulled back, eyes that suggested she had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little. She gestured Tom inside without ceremony. Her office was functional rather than comfortable. File cabinets, bookshelves heavy with legal volumes, a desk organized with the precision of someone who dealt in facts and procedure. She sat and folded her hands, waiting. Tom opened the folder and began laying out documents. He had practiced this presentation, had organized the material to tell its story clearly, chronologically, building from foundation to inevitable conclusion. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes, walking her through the timeline, the witness statements, the physical evidence. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, her expression giving nothing away. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and studied the documents spread across her desk. "This is substantial," she said finally. "More than I expected when you first called." "Will you reopen the investigation?" Tom asked. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. The Frank Carver disappearance was never officially closed. It was suspended pending new evidence. "What you have brought me constitutes new evidence. So yes, I will review it thoroughly. I will need to verify the authenticity of these documents, interview the witnesses you have mentioned, consult with state authorities about jurisdiction and statute of limitations." She paused, met his eyes directly. "But I wanted to be clear about expectations. Everyone involved in the original events is either dead or very old. Howard Carver Sr. died in 2005. Even if we conclude that he was responsible for Frank Carver's death, we cannot prosecute a dead man. The best we can do is establish truth for the historical record." "What about the land fraud?" Tom asked. "The 60 acres that were stolen from my grandfather?" "That is a civil matter," she replied, "outside my jurisdiction. But if our investigation confirms the survey was falsified, that would provide grounds for the Hartford estate to pursue civil action against the current property owners. That would be Howard Carver Jr. "So he could lose the land," Tom said. "Potentially," she agreed, "along with having his family's reputation destroyed. That will not happen quickly or easily. He has resources, connections. He will fight it." Tom had expected this. Still, hearing it laid out so plainly made the path ahead feel longer, more difficult. "How long will your review take?" he asked. "Weeks at minimum," she said. "Possibly months. This is 40 years old. I need to be thorough." In the meantime, I would ask that you not speak publicly about this. Once an official investigation is active, public statements can complicate things legally. Tom hesitated. People already know I have been asking questions. Word is spreading. Then let it spread quietly, she said. Do not give interviews. Do not post on social media. Do not turn this into a circus before we have established facts. Can you do that? For now, Tom said. She stood, signaling the meeting's end. I will be in touch as the review progresses. Thank you for bringing this forward. Whatever the outcome, it took courage. Tom gathered the documents and left, descending the stairs with a sense of having crossed a threshold. The investigation was no longer his alone. It belonged now to official channels, to people with authority and resources he lacked. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like loss of control, like watching something precious slip from his hands into a system that might or might not treat it with the care it deserved. Outside, the day was bright and cool, autumn asserting itself in the angle of light and the quality of air. Tom sat in his truck for several minutes, letting his heart beat slow before driving back to the farm. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. Tom continued to work on the property, repairing what could be repaired, maintaining what needed maintenance. Physical labor that occupied his hands while his mind turned over possibilities and consequences. He waited for word from the district attorney's office, checking his phone more often than necessary, feeling the tension of suspended action. But the town had noticed his activities. Word spread in the way of small communities, quietly and thoroughly. People he did not know began driving past the farm, slowing to stare. Some waved, others did not. A few stopped to talk, asking questions he deflected as politely as he could. What was he looking for? What had he found? Was it true he was trying to clear his grandfather's name? He gave vague answers, said he was trying to understand what had happened, said the truth mattered even after so much time, said very little else. The reactions varied. Some people expressed support, usually quietly, away from others who might hear. A woman in her 70s stopped him outside the hardware store and said she had never believed Walter was guilty, that she was glad someone was finally asking questions. A man who had gone to school with Walter told Tom that his grandfather had been a good man, that the town had done him wrong. But others were hostile. A rancher whose land adjoined what had been Carver property made a point of telling Tom he was stirring up trouble over nothing, that some things were better left buried. The current owner of the feed store, son of the man who had served Walter decades earlier, suggested that Tom was trying to profit from sympathy, that dredging up old accusations helped no one. The division was not clean. People who had been friends found themselves on opposite sides of questions they had not examined in years. Conversations at the diner grew careful, loaded with unspoken tension. The town was being forced to reconsider a narrative it had lived with so long it felt like fact. Tom felt the weight of this every time he went into Cedar Ridge, felt himself becoming a symbol of something larger than his individual search for truth. Some saw him as courage personified, finally demanding justice. Others saw him as a troublemaker, disrupting peace for the sake of a grandfather who had probably been guilty anyway. He tried not to care about the opinions, tried to focus on what mattered. But the isolation was real and growing. He understood in a way he had not before what Walter's life must have been like. The constant awareness of being watched, judged, discussed. The way a trip to buy groceries became an exercise in endurance. 2 weeks after his meeting with the district attorney, Tom received a call from an investigator named Richard Torres. He identified himself as working for the DA's office, said he needed to visit the farm to examine the site where Walter had found the buried evidence. Torres arrived the next morning, a man in his 40s with the methodical manner of someone trained in evidence collection. Tom walked him to the boundary line, showed him the approximate location. Torres photographed everything, took soil samples, made detailed notes. He asked questions about when Walter had made the discovery, how the items had been preserved, who had handled them since. Tom answered as accurately as he could, showed Torres the corn crib, explained how Walter had hidden the evidence there. The investigator spent an hour examining the structure, taking measurements, photographing the interior. Before he left, Torres paused by his vehicle. The DA wanted me to tell you that the review is proceeding. We have confirmed the authenticity of most of the documents you provided. We are working on locating and interviewing witnesses. This is being taken seriously. Tom felt something ease in his chest. Thank you. One more thing, Torres added. We accessed the original case files from storage. There were items in those files that were never part of the official record. Photographs that should have been logged as evidence but were not. Reports that contradict the public narrative. Someone went to considerable effort to shape how this case was perceived. Can you tell me what you found, Tom asked. Not yet, Torres said. But when we are ready to release findings, you will know. After he drove away, Tom stood in the yard feeling both vindicated and frustrated. The system was working, slowly, but every day of delay meant more time for opposition to organize, for the story to be controlled by people who had an interest in controlling it. That evening, Carl Brennan called. His voice was urgent, strained. Tom, I need to see you. Tonight, if possible. There is something you need to know. They met at a diner 2 counties over, far enough from Cedar Ridge to avoid being seen by people who might recognize them. Carl was already there when Tom arrived, sitting in a back booth with coffee he had not touched. Tom slid into the seat across from him. What is it? Carl looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier, as if the decision to speak had aged him visibly. I have been thinking about the boot print, he said, the one from the scene where Frank's truck was found. I told you it matched Howard Carver Sr.'s boots. Tom nodded, waiting. I went back to the storage unit, looked through the evidence boxes again. That photograph is gone. Someone removed it. When? Tom asked, his stomach tightening. I do not know. Could have been any time in the last 40 years. But it was there when I filed my report in '83. I remember taking that photo myself, logging it, putting it in the file. Now it is not there. Someone destroyed evidence, Tom said. Or moved it, Carl replied. But either way, it is gone. And without it, we cannot prove the boot print matched Howard Carver's custom boots. It becomes my word, the memory of an old deputy, against nothing. Tom felt the edges of the case he had been building begin to crumble. Physical evidence disappearing. Official records manipulated. The system that was supposed to seek truth-protecting lies instead. Did you tell the district attorney, he asked. Not yet, Carl said. I wanted you to know first. But I will tell her. She needs to understand how deep this goes. How much effort was put into making sure the truth stayed buried. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of corruption settling over them. Finally, Carl spoke again, his voice heavy. There is something else. The toxicology report on your grandfather's water supply. The one showing sedatives consistent with what Carver's ranch used. That is also missing from the files. I know it existed. I read it. Now it is gone too. Tom closed his eyes. How many pieces of evidence were removed? I do not know, Carl admitted, but enough that the case against your grandfather looks thinner than it did, and the case against Howard Carver Sr. is harder to prove. Someone cleaned house, probably years ago when they thought no one would ever look again. Can we prove any of this? Tom asked. Carl pulled a folder from beside him on the seat. I kept copies. Not of everything, but of some things, including my original report that mentioned the boot print and the water contamination. It is not the same as having the physical evidence, but it is something. He slid the folder across the table. Tom opened it and found photocopies of documents, yellowed and faded but legible. Carl's handwriting on incident reports, references to evidence that no longer existed in official files, proof that the record had been altered. Why did you keep these? Tom asked. Because I knew even then that something was wrong, Carl said. I knew the investigation was being steered away from the truth. I kept copies because I thought someday they might matter. I just did not think it would take 40 years. Tom gathered the folder carefully. This changes things. It complicates things, Carl corrected. We can prove the evidence existed. We can prove it was removed. But we still cannot prove who removed it or why. And we cannot prove Howard Carver killed Frank without physical evidence linking him to the crime. But we can prove the investigation was corrupted, Tom said. Carl nodded slowly. That is something, maybe enough. They left separately, Tom waiting 10 minutes before walking to his truck. He drove back to the farm through darkness, the folder on the seat beside him, thinking about the layers of deception that had been required to protect Howard Carver Sr. Not just suppressing evidence, but removing it entirely. Not just ignoring witness testimony, but erasing it from the record. It was not enough to frame Walter Hartford. They had to ensure the frame held, that no one could later prove it was false. That required access, authority, the cooperation or at least the silence of people who should have been guardians of truth. At the farm, Tom added Carl's copies to his own files. The evidence continued to accumulate even as official evidence disappeared. It was like trying to build a case against ghosts, against a system that had learned to protect itself by erasing its own tracks. He called the district attorney's office the next morning and left a message for Torres. Said he had new information about missing evidence, about the systematic removal of materials from the original case files. Torres called back within an hour. "We know," he said simply. "We discovered the same thing when we reviewed the files. Multiple items logged in initial reports but absent from storage. We are trying to determine when and how they went missing." "Can you prove it was deliberate?" Tom asked. "We can prove items are missing. Proving who removed them and when is harder. But it establishes a pattern. Someone went to considerable effort to protect Howard Carver Sr. "What happens now?" Tom asked. "We continue," Torres said. "Missing evidence does not stop an investigation. It just changes how we build the case. We focus on what we have. Witness testimony, documents that were preserved outside official channels. The pattern of corruption itself becomes evidence of something worth hiding." Tom felt a flicker of hope. "When will you go public with findings?" "Soon," Torres said. "The DA wants to complete interviews first. But we are close, weeks rather than months." After hanging up, Tom walked out to the corn crib. The structure stood empty now, its purpose fulfilled, but he found himself drawn to it repeatedly. It represented something that official channels had never managed: the preservation of truth despite the best efforts of powerful people to destroy it. Walter had understood that he could not trust the system, had understood that evidence placed in official hands could be made to disappear. So he had created his own archive, hidden it in the most unlikely place, and trusted that eventually someone would care enough to find it. That trust was being vindicated, slowly, imperfectly, against resistance and obstacles, but vindicated nonetheless. Tom spent the afternoon repairing fence, work that required attention but not deep thought. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind processed everything that was happening. The investigation proceeding. Evidence missing, but its absence now documented. The town dividing over questions it had thought settled. He wondered what Walter would think of all this. Whether he would be pleased that the truth was finally being acknowledged or saddened that it required so much effort, so much time. Whether vindication after death meant anything or if it was just theater for the living. A truck pulled into the drive around 4 in the afternoon. Tom recognized it before the driver got out. Howard Carver Jr. He had not seen or spoken to Howard since their confrontation weeks earlier. The man who stepped from the truck looked diminished somehow, as if something internal had collapsed. Tom set down his tools and walked to meet him. They stood in the yard, afternoon light slanting across the space between them. "The DA's investigator came to see me," Howard said without preamble. "Asked questions about my father, about the land transfer, about what I knew and when I knew it." "What did you tell him?" Tom asked. "The truth," Howard said. "That I was 23 when Frank disappeared, that my father handled everything, that I inherited land I thought was legitimately ours, that I never questioned the story I was raised with." He paused, looking toward the fields. "But I should have questioned it. I am 64 years old. I have had 40 years to ask why Frank vanished, why the investigation went nowhere, why your grandfather was blamed without being charged. I never asked because I did not want to know the answer." Tom said nothing, letting Howard speak. "My father was not a good man," Howard continued. "I knew that. He was hard, demanding. He built what he had through force of will and willingness to do what others would not. I told myself that made him strong. Now I wonder if it just made him ruthless." He turned to face Tom directly. "If the investigation proves my father killed Frank, if it proves he stole your grandfather's land, I will not fight it. I will cooperate. I will return what was taken. I will not defend what cannot be defended." Tom felt surprise, then something closer to respect. "That will cost you." "Everything," Howard agreed. "My reputation, my standing in this community. Probably most of the ranch, but I have been thinking about what it cost your grandfather to be falsely accused. He lost everything too. The difference is he was innocent." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Howard extended his hand. Tom hesitated, then took it. The handshake was brief, formal, but it felt like something important. An acknowledgement, a beginning toward accountability. After Howard drove away, Tom sat on the porch steps and watched the sun descend. The days were getting shorter, autumn moving toward winter, time passing, things changing, the shape of the future becoming visible even if its details remained uncertain. He thought about the cost of what he had set in motion. Not just to Howard Carver Jr., though that cost would be real and permanent, but to the entire community. People would have to reconsider judgments they had lived with for decades, would have to admit, at least privately, that they had been wrong, that their silence had enabled injustice, that their comfort had been purchased with another man's suffering. Some would make that admission. Others never would. They would find ways to minimize, to explain, to maintain the narratives that allowed them to sleep at night. That was human nature. The capacity for self-justification was nearly infinite. But the truth would be out there. Official. Documented. Impossible to completely ignore even for those determined to trick. Tom wondered how Walter would have felt about all this. Whether vindication after death meant anything, or was just performance for the living. He suspected Walter would have been quietly pleased, but also sad. Sad that it had taken so long. Sad that the system had failed so completely. Sad that truth required such monumental effort to surface. But Walter had done his part, had preserved the evidence, had maintained faith that it would someday matter. The rest was up to those who came after. The evening light turned golden, then amber, then faded into dusk. Tom remained on the porch, watching shadows lengthen across the yard. He had lived most of his life away from this place, had built an identity separate from it. But now, sitting here in the gathering dark, he felt connected to it in ways he had not anticipated. This land had shaped Walter, had tested him, had witnessed his endurance. And now it was shaping Tom, teaching him things about courage and persistence and the long arc of truth. He rose eventually and went inside, made a simple dinner that he ate without tasting, tried to read but could not focus, ended up at the kitchen table again with Walter's journals, reading entries from years he had not yet examined. The journals revealed a man trying to make sense of his exile, not with bitterness, but with a kind of careful observation, as if by documenting his isolation he could understand it, could find meaning in it. Walter wrote about the rhythm of farm work, about seasons and weather, about the small satisfactions of fixing broken things. He wrote very little about people. When he did, it was usually to record some interaction in town, some moment when the distance between him and the community became visible. A conversation cut short, a greeting not returned, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who had decided you did not exist. Reading these entries, Tom felt the full weight of what his grandfather had endured. Not just the initial accusation, but the daily grind of being erased. The way isolation became normal. The way silence became the default mode of existence. And yet Walter had continued, had gotten up each morning, had done the work, had maintained the farm even though no one saw or cared, had lived deliberately as if his life still mattered even when the world said otherwise. There was something almost sacred in that persistence, a refusal to be diminished by the diminishment of others. A commitment to dignity that did not depend on external recognition. Tom had not understood this about his grandfather when Walter was alive, had seen only the withdrawal, the silence, the strangeness, had not recognized it as survival strategy, as the necessary adaptation of a man trying to preserve himself in hostile territory. He understood it now, and the understanding came with guilt so sharp it was almost physical. He had abandoned Walter, had chosen distance and safety, had let his grandfather die alone, still carrying the weight of false accusation. That could not be undone. The years could not be recovered. But Tom could finish what Walter had started, could use the evidence Walter had preserved to force acknowledgement of truth, could give Walter in death the vindication he never received in life. It was not enough, could never be enough, but it was what was available. That evening, he received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was female, elderly, tentative. "Is this Tom Hartford?" she asked. "Yes. My name is Dorothy Hendricks. I was on the county commission in 1984. I voted against the land transfer to Howard Carver." Tom sat up straighter. "I saw your dissent in the records. You asked for an investigation." "I did," she said. "Not that it mattered. They approved it anyway. But I wanted you to know why I objected. I worked in the county clerk's office before I was elected to the commission. I processed the survey documents. They were wrong, obviously wrong. The signatures did not match. The measurements contradicted the original survey from 65. I took my concerns to my supervisor. He told me to file the paperwork and keep quiet." "Did you?" Tom asked. "To my shame, yes," she replied. "I was young. I needed the job. So I filed documents I knew were fraudulent. Then years later, when I was on the commission and the transfer came up for approval, I tried to make it right. I requested investigation. I was outvoted and ignored. She paused, her breath audible over the line. I have lived with that guilt for 40 years. When I heard you were looking into this, I knew I had to call. I have written a formal statement. Everything I know about the fraud, I am sending it to the district attorney. But I wanted you to know first. Thank you, Tom said, his voice rough. This will help. It will help a lot. Your grandfather was a good man, Dorothy said quietly. He deserved better than what we gave him. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to say that publicly. After they hung up, Tom sat in the dark kitchen, phone still in his hand. The witnesses were coming forward. People who had carried private guilt, private knowledge, were finally speaking. Not all of them. Probably not even most. But enough. Enough to establish truth. He added Dorothy Hendricks to his mental list of allies. People willing to go on record, to acknowledge their part in what had happened, to try, however late, to make it right. The list was growing. Carl Brennan, Pastor Mills, Patricia Carver, Dorothy Hendricks, Margaret Chen, even Howard Carver Jr. in his way. People who had lived with knowledge or suspicion or guilt and were now finding the courage to speak. They were not heroes. Most had been complicit through action or inaction. But they were human, capable of growth, of change, of choosing truth even when it was costly. Tom thought about calling James, updating him on Dorothy's statement. But it was late and the news could wait. Instead, he poured a glass of water and carried it upstairs. In bed, he lay in darkness, listening to the house settle. Tomorrow would bring more developments, more witnesses, more evidence. The investigation was gaining momentum, building towards some kind of resolution. He felt simultaneously energized and exhausted. The work was necessary, important, but it was also draining in ways he had not anticipated. The emotional toll of confronting decades of injustice. The weight of being the only person willing to do what needed doing. Sleep came slowly. His mind would not quiet, kept turning over pieces of the puzzle. But when sleep finally arrived, it was deep and dreamless. Morning brought fog that hung over the fields like breath made visible. Tom stood at the window with coffee and watched it slowly dissipate as the sun climbed higher. The phone rang before he had finished his first cup. It was Torres. The DA has scheduled a press conference for tomorrow. She will be releasing preliminary findings from the review. She wanted you to know in advance so you are not blindsided. What will she say? Tom asked. That the original investigation into Frank Carver's disappearance was compromised by evidence suppression and investigator bias. That there is substantial reason to believe Walter Hartford was wrongly suspected. That the land transfer from Hartford to Carver was based on fraudulent survey documents. That the case is being officially reopened as a homicide investigation with Howard Carver Sr. as the primary person of interest, though deceased. Tom felt something enormous shift in his chest. She is going to clear my grandfather's name. She is going to state that the evidence does not support the suspicion that fell on him, Torres corrected. That is not the same as proving innocence, but it is the best we can do given the limitations of time and missing evidence. It is enough, Tom said quietly. There will be media, Torres warned. Reporters from Denver, probably some from national outlets. This is the kind of story that gets attention. Small-town corruption, 40-year cover-up, wrongful accusation. You should prepare yourself. Tom had not thought about that, had been so focused on establishing truth that he had not considered the spectacle that truth might create. Will I need to speak? He asked. The DA would like you available for questions, but that is your choice. You can decline. I will be there, Tom said. After ending the call, he sat at the kitchen table and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Cameras, questions, the story of Walter's persecution becoming public knowledge. The town's long-held narrative being officially challenged. Some would accept it, others would resist, but it would be out there, impossible to ignore. Walter Hartford would no longer be the man suspected of murder. He would be the man wrongly accused, the victim rather than the perpetrator. It was not justice. Justice would have been belief from the beginning, but it was vindication, and vindication, however late, mattered. He spent the morning preparing, organizing his thoughts, deciding what he would say if asked to speak publicly. He kept his notes simple, factual, focused on Walter's integrity and the importance of truth even when it arrives late. By afternoon, he felt as ready as he would ever be. He called James and told him about the press conference. His brother listened quietly, then said he would drive out tonight, would be there tomorrow to stand beside Tom when the findings were released. "Thank you," Tom said. "We should have done this together from the start," James replied. "I am glad we are doing it together now." The rest of the day passed in a strange suspension. Tom tried to work, to focus on ordinary tasks, but his mind kept drifting to tomorrow, to what would be said, how it would be received, what it would mean for Walter's memory, for the farm, for his own future. He walked the property in late afternoon, needing movement, needing to ground himself in physical space. He walked the boundaries, touched fence posts, stood in fields where wheat had once grown. He went to the place where Walter had found the buried evidence, knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. This land remembered, had witnessed everything. The arguments and threats, the disappearance, the framing, the theft, 4 decades of Walter's lonely endurance. And now, finally, the slow emergence of truth. He stood and walked into the corn crib, stood inside the empty structure, and felt the weight of what Walter had built here. Not just a storage facility, but a monument to the possibility that truth could survive even when no one wanted to hear it. Tomorrow, the silence would break completely. The story would be told in press conferences and news reports. The system that had failed Walter would be forced to acknowledge that failure. It would not bring Walter back, would not give him the years he lost to isolation and blame, but it would give him something he had never had in life. The acknowledgement that he had been right, that his version of events, carefully documented and patiently preserved, was closer to truth than the narrative the town had accepted. Tom left the corn crib and walked back to the house slowly, letting the rhythm of his steps settle his mind. The sun was descending, light turning golden. Birds called from the cottonwoods. The air carried the smell of autumn, of harvest and decline and the turning of seasons. Everything was in motion. Everything was changing. But the land remained, patient, witnessing, remembering. Inside, Tom gathered his evidence one more time, made sure everything was organized, accessible, clear. He had copies of the documents the district attorney would reference, photographs of the physical evidence, witness statements, the timeline he had constructed. It was all there, the complete story, as complete as it could be given the missing pieces and the passage of time. Not perfect, but true enough. As darkness fell, he heard a vehicle in the drive. James had arrived earlier than expected. Tom went out to meet him, and the brothers embraced in the yard, holding on longer than they had since they were boys. "We are going to finish this," James said. "For Grandpa, for all of us." Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They went inside together and sat at the kitchen table where so much of this had unfolded. Tom showed James the evidence, walked him through the timeline, explained what the district attorney would announce tomorrow. James listened with the attention of someone trying to absorb years of information in a single evening. When Tom finished, he looked at the documents spread before them and shook his head slowly. He kept all of this for 40 years, never gave up on the possibility that someday it would matter. He trusted someone would come, Tom said. Someone would look, someone would care. James met his eyes. He trusted you, even when you were not here, even when you stayed away. He left this for you because he knew you would do the right thing when you found it. The words hit Tom hard. He had not thought of it that way, had seen his discovery of the evidence as accident or providence. But maybe Walter had known, had trusted that eventually the distance between them would be crossed, that Tom would return and would find what had been left for him. That trust, after everything, felt like forgiveness. The brothers sat together as night deepened around them. They talked about Walter, about memories they had both suppressed, about the man he had been before the accusation and the man he had become after, about the cost of silence and the value of speaking. James shared things Tom had not known. How Walter had written to him over the years, brief letters that James had rarely answered. How the old man had sent money when James was in college, even though James had never asked and had barely acknowledged it. How Walter had continued to care even when his caring was not returned. "I thought staying away was protecting myself," James said quietly. "But really, I was just being a coward. Easier to believe the town's version than to question it. Easier to pretend I did not have a grandfather than to be associated with one everyone thought was a killer." Tom understood. He had done the same thing for the same reasons. They had both chosen comfort over loyalty, had both failed Walter when he needed them. "But we are here now," Tom said. "That has to count for something." James nodded. "It does. It counts for a lot." They sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by Walter's things, his presence palpable in the worn furniture and the careful organization of drawers. The house felt full of him, not haunted exactly, but inhabited by memory and intent. Around midnight, James stood and stretched. I should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be long. Tom agreed. They climbed the stairs together, James taking the guest room Tom had prepared, Tom returning to the bedroom he had claimed as his own. In bed, Tom lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what morning would bring. He felt ready and terrified in equal measure, ready to speak the truth, terrified of the reaction it would provoke. But fear was not a reason to stop. Walter had been afraid too, had faced hostility and isolation and the slow erosion of his reputation. Had endured all of it because enduring was the only option available to him. Tom's task was easier. He had allies, he had evidence, he had official support. All he had to do was show up and speak honestly. Sleep finally came in the small hours, brief and fitful. When Tom woke, gray light was already seeping through the curtains. He rose and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt appropriate for the occasion. Jeans and a button-down shirt, work boots, nothing fancy but clean and presentable. Downstairs, James was already up, making coffee. They ate breakfast in near silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what was coming filled the kitchen, made ordinary conversation impossible. At 9, they climbed into Tom's truck and drove towards Cedar Ridge. The press conference was scheduled for 10 at the courthouse. Tom wanted to arrive early, to be present and ready before the media descended. The drive took 20 minutes. Neither brother spoke. The landscape rolled past, familiar and strange, fields and fences and the long horizon. They were driving towards something that could not be undone. Once the district attorney spoke, once the findings were public, there would be no taking it back. The courthouse parking lot was already filling when they arrived. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters with cameras and microphones. People from town, curious or supportive or angry, gathering in clusters. Tom parked and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing slowly. "You ready?" James asked. "No," Tom said honestly, "but we are doing it anyway." They got out of the truck and walked toward the courthouse steps. People turned to look. Some nodded. Others stared with expressions Tom could not read. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the door, on putting one foot in front of the other. Inside, the building was cooler, quieter. Torres met them in the lobby, guided them to a conference room where the district attorney was preparing. Patricia Reeves looked up as they entered, her expression serious but not unkind. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wanted you here for this. What we are about to announce is because of what you brought forward. You should be present when it becomes public." Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. "The press conference will be brief," she continued. "I will make a statement, take a few questions, then it is over. You do not have to speak unless you want to." "I want to," Tom said. "Then I will introduce you at the end. Keep it short, factual, emotional is fine, but do not editorialize. Let the evidence speak." At 10, they moved to the courthouse steps where a podium and microphones had been set up. The crowd had grown, cameras pointed, reporters jostled for position. Tom stood to the side with James, trying to be invisible, trying to breathe normally. Patricia Reeves stepped to the podium. The crowd quieted. She looked directly into the cameras and began to speak. "Good morning. I am District Attorney Patricia Reeves. I am here today to announce the findings of a review into the 1983 disappearance of Frank Carver and the subsequent investigation." Her voice was clear, authoritative. She laid out the facts methodically. The original investigation, the evidence that had been suppressed or ignored, the witness testimony that contradicted the accepted narrative, the fraudulent land transfer, the systematic corruption that had protected Howard Carver Sr. while destroying Walter Hartford's reputation. It is the conclusion of this office that Walter Hartford was wrongly suspected in the disappearance of Frank Carver. The evidence does not support the suspicion that fell upon him. Further, we have determined that the land transfer of 60 acres from Hartford to Carver was based on fraudulent survey documents and should be considered void. We are reopening this case as an active homicide investigation. While the primary person of interest, Howard Carver Sr., is deceased, we believe the evidence warrants formal acknowledgement of what occurred. Truth matters. Justice, even when delayed, matters. She spoke for 10 minutes, then opened the floor to questions. Reporters shouted, competing to be heard. She answered calmly, refusing to speculate, sticking to established facts. Finally, she said, "I would like to introduce Tom Hartford, grandson of Walter Hartford." Tom discovered the evidence that made this review possible. He has a brief statement. Tom stepped forward, his legs unsteady, his heart hammering. He looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the faces watching him, took a breath. "My grandfather lived 40 years under a cloud of suspicion he did not deserve. He was never charged, never tried, but he was convicted in the court of public opinion and sentenced to isolation and shame. He endured that with dignity. He preserved evidence because he believed truth mattered. He trusted that eventually someone would care enough to look. I wish I had looked sooner. I wish I had questioned. I wish I had stood beside him when he needed it. But I did not. I stayed away. I chose comfort over loyalty. I cannot undo that, cannot give him back the years he lost. But I can speak now, can say publicly what should have been said 40 years ago. Walter Hartford was innocent. He was a good man who was treated badly by people who should have known better, including me. This is not about revenge. It is about acknowledgement, about saying that truth matters even when it is inconvenient, about insisting that we do better. Thank you." He stepped back from the podium. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then questions erupted. Tom shook his head, indicated he was done speaking. Patricia Reeves resumed her position, answered a few more questions, then ended the press conference. Inside the courthouse, away from cameras, Tom leaned against a wall and let his breath out slowly. James stood beside him, hand on his shoulder. "You did good," his brother said quietly. Torres approached, nodded approvingly. "The story will run everywhere. National news by tonight. You have given your grandfather his voice back." Tom could only nod. Emotion was too close to the surface. If he tried to speak, he would lose control. Outside, the crowd dispersed gradually. Reporters packed up equipment. Town residents stood in clusters, talking in low voices. The story was out. The truth was public. What happened next was beyond Tom's control. He and James left through a side door, avoiding the remaining media. Drove back to the farm in silence. The weight of what they had done was settling over them, heavy and strange and somehow right. At the farm, they sat on the porch and watched afternoon turn to evening. Neither spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. The corn crib stood solid against the declining sun, its purpose fulfilled, its testimony delivered. Walter Hartford's long silence had finally been broken, and Tom Hartford, who had returned to this place expecting only to close a chapter, had instead opened one that would reshape everything he thought he knew about family, about truth, about the cost of courage and the value of speaking when silence would be easier. The sun descended, stars appeared, the land held its peace, and somewhere in the gathering dark, Tom felt his grandfather's presence, felt something like approval, like release. The burden had been carried long enough. Now, at last, it could be set down. The story ran everywhere. By evening, Walter Hartford's name was appearing on national news broadcasts, in newspapers across the country, on websites and social media platforms Tom barely understood. The narrative was compelling in ways that transcended its particulars: small-town injustice, decades of silence, a grandson's determination to restore a grandfather's honor, truth emerging from corn and darkness. Tom watched some of the coverage that first night, sitting in the farmhouse with James, the television casting blue light across their faces. Some reporters got the details right, others sensationalized or simplified. A few missed the point entirely, framing it as a mystery solved rather than a systemic failure acknowledged. But the core truth was out there now, impossible to retract. Walter Hartford had been wrongly suspected. The evidence proved it. Official channels confirmed it. Whatever else happened, that much was established. The phone rang constantly those first days. Reporters requesting interviews. Producers from documentary programs wanting to tell Walter's story with dramatic reenactments and solemn narration. Lawyers discussing the land dispute and what remedies might be available after so many years. Tom answered some calls, let others go to voicemail. He was not ready yet to process what any of this meant beyond the immediate fact of vindication. James fielded what he could, his presence a steadying force. The brothers developed a rhythm over those chaotic first weeks. James handled logistics, screening calls, responding to official inquiries. Tom tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, working on the farm, repairing fence and clearing brush. The physical labor provided anchor, when everything else felt untethered from reality. They talked in the evenings, sitting on the porch as darkness gathered, processing the magnitude of what had been set in motion. James spoke about his own guilt, the years he had spent believing the town's narrative without question, the ease with which he had written off Walter as someone shameful rather than someone wronged. "I told myself I was protecting my family by staying away," James said one night, "that associating with him would taint my kids. But really I was just protecting myself from discomfort, from having to defend someone everyone else had condemned." Tom understood. He had done the same thing for the same reasons. They had both chosen the path of least resistance, and Walter had paid the price for their cowardice. "But we are making it right now," Tom said. "As much as we can." "Is that enough?" James asked. "It has to be," Tom replied. "It is all we have." 3 days after the press conference, the district attorney's office released its full report. 200 pages of detailed findings, witness testimony, expert analysis of the fraudulent survey documents, timeline reconstruction showing how systematically Howard Carver Sr. had worked to frame Walter and steal his land. The report was thorough and damning. It named names, identified failures at every level of the justice system, traced the network of complicity that had enabled one man's persecution. Some of those named were still alive. Their responses varied wildly. A retired county clerk issued a public apology, saying she had processed documents she knew were fraudulent because her supervisor had ordered her to. A former deputy who had worked under Sheriff Morrison admitted he had been told to ignore evidence that did not fit the preferred narrative. These confessions added weight to what the report documented. But others denied everything, claimed they had acted on the information available at the time, insisted they had done nothing improper, found ways to minimize their involvement or shift blame to people who were conveniently dead and could not defend themselves. The community of Cedar Ridge found itself forced into a reckoning it had avoided for 40 years. Conversations that should have happened in 1983 were finally occurring, painful and necessary and long overdue. The town could not simply move on, could not pretend this was ancient history that bore no relation to the present, because it did bear relation. The people who had participated in Walter's persecution, actively or through silence, were parents and grandparents now. Their children had been raised on the story of Walter Hartford, the probable killer. That story had shaped values, taught lessons about justice and guilt, and the reliability of community consensus. Now those lessons had to be unlearned. That story had to be revised. And revision, Tom was discovering, was infinitely harder than initial telling. Pastor Mills organized a community meeting at the church open to anyone who wanted to attend. Tom was hesitant about going, uncertain of his welcome, uncertain whether he could maintain composure in the face of what might be said. But James convinced him it mattered to be present. "We cannot ask them to confront this if we are not willing to witness it," James said. The church was full when they arrived. Every pew occupied, people standing along the walls and in the doorways. Tom recognized faces from town: the woman who ran the post office, the man who owned the feed store, teachers and farmers and business owners. Some nodded as he passed. Others looked away. A few watched with expressions he could not read, something between curiosity and resentment. Pastor Mills stood at the front, his white hair catching the light from the tall windows, and spoke with a gravity that commanded attention even from those who might have preferred not to hear. "We are here because we failed," he began, his voice clear and steady. "Not all of us directly, not all of us consciously, but collectively, we failed. We allowed an innocent man to be condemned without proof. We participated in his isolation through our silence. We chose comfort over truth. And Walter Hartford paid the price for our choice." The church was silent. People shifted in their seats, but no one spoke. The weight of acknowledgement hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. "Some of you were not born when this happened," Pastor Mills continued. "This is not your fault, but it is your inheritance. The town you grew up in was shaped by this injustice, by what we did and what we failed to do. Acknowledging that is the first step toward something better, toward becoming a community that demands evidence before judgment, that stands with the accused rather than against them, that chooses truth even when it is uncomfortable." He opened the floor for anyone who wanted to speak. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable. Then slowly, haltingly, an elderly man Tom did not recognize rose from a pew near the back. I was on the search party when we looked for Frank Carver, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I remember thinking even then that it seemed wrong to focus only on Hartford. There were other possibilities, other people who might have had reason to want Frank gone. But I said nothing. I kept my doubts to myself because it was easier than speaking up. I am sorry for that. I am sorry I was not braver. He sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a woman in her 60s stood, her hands gripping the pew in front of her. I was in high school when it happened. I remember how kids talked about Tom and James Hartford, how we treated them. We were cruel because we thought we were supposed to be, because the adults around us made it clear that the Hartford family was suspect, that association with them was unwise. I participated in that cruelty. I am ashamed of it. I want them to know I am sorry. One by one, people rose to confess their parts in the collective failure. Not everyone. Some sat rigid and silent, refusing to participate in what they clearly viewed as unnecessary self-flagellation, as disloyalty to the community's established narrative. But enough people spoke to make clear that the acknowledgement was real, that something in the town's conscience was shifting. Beth from the diner stood, her voice breaking as she spoke. I served Walter Hartford for 30 years after Frank disappeared. He came in every Tuesday, sat in the same booth, ordered the same thing. Never caused trouble, never complained, paid his check, and said thank you every single time. And I never once told him I believed he was innocent. Never once offered kindness beyond basic service. I just served his food and took his money and let him sit there alone while conversations stopped around him. He must have been so lonely. I think about that now, and it breaks my heart. Tom felt his throat tighten. Hearing these confessions, these late recognitions of Walter's humanity, was almost harder than the years of silence had been, because they confirmed what he had suspected, that people had known, or at least doubted, but had chosen safety over courage, had participated in isolation not out of conviction, but out of fear of standing apart from the crowd. Near the end of the meeting, Howard Carver Jr. stood. The room grew very quiet. Howard looked diminished, older than his 64 years, his face drawn with what looked like genuine anguish. My father was guilty, he said simply, the words falling into silence. Of what exactly we may never know for certain, but guilty of something. Guilty of destroying a man's reputation. Guilty of stealing land. Guilty of building an empire on lies and intimidation. And I spent 60 years defending him without questioning, without asking the questions I should have asked. I benefited from land that was stolen, from a reputation built on the suffering of others. I am selling the ranch, returning the 60 acres to the Hartford estate, establishing a fund for the families affected by my father's actions. It does not undo anything, but it is what I can do. He sat down heavily. Someone in the back started clapping, hesitant at first, then others joined, until the church filled with applause. Not celebration exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement of the difficulty of what Howard had said, of the cost it represented, of the courage it took to stand against family legacy and admit wrongdoing. When the meeting ended, people approached Tom, some to apologize for their silence, others to thank him for bringing the truth forward, for refusing to let the past stay buried. A few just to shake his hand, wordless but present, offering solidarity they had never offered Walter. Tom accepted it all with as much grace as he could manage, though the emotional toll was immense. Each confession, each apology, felt like a small stone added to a cairn he was building in Walter's memory. Not heavy stones, but significant ones. Evidence that the work had mattered. Outside, standing in the parking lot as people dispersed into the evening, James put his hand on Tom's shoulder and squeezed. That was important, he said, not just for them. For us, too, we needed to hear that people understand what was done, that they are willing to acknowledge it. Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The lump in his throat made words impossible. The legal process moved faster than Tom had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, a judge ruled that the 1984 land transfer had been based on fraudulent documents and was therefore void. The 60 acres legally reverted to the Hartford estate, which now meant Tom and James as Walter's heirs. Howard Carver Jr. did not contest the ruling. He signed the necessary paperwork without argument, his lawyer issuing a statement saying Mr. Carver acknowledged the injustice done and sought to make what amends he could. Then Howard listed the remainder of his ranch for sale. The Cedar Ridge Gazette ran a story about the end of the Carver ranching empire, 3 generations reduced to legal documents and real estate listings, in the slow dissolution of a legacy built on corruption. Tom felt no satisfaction in Howard's fall, only a kind of sad recognition that justice, even when served, rarely felt like victory. It felt more like accounting, balances corrected, debts acknowledged if not fully paid. The ledger brought closer to equilibrium, but never quite balanced. The brothers met with lawyers to discuss what to do with the farm and the recovered land. They could sell it all, split the proceeds, return to their separate lives enriched by inheritance but otherwise unchanged. They could keep it as investment property, lease it to farmers, maintain ownership without presence or responsibility. They had options. Financial advisors laid out scenarios, showed them projections of value and return, but neither option felt right. Neither honored what Walter had preserved or what his suffering had purchased. It was James who first suggested the alternative. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun descend toward the horizon, when he spoke the idea that had been forming in both their minds. "What if we turn it into something that honors what happened here?" he said quietly. "Not a museum exactly, but a place that teaches, that preserves the story and uses it to educate." Tom had been thinking along similar lines. "What did you have in mind?" "An agricultural education center," James said, his voice gaining confidence. "For kids from the region who want to learn farming but cannot afford traditional programs. Scholarships funded by the land itself, and part of the property preserved exactly as it is. The house, the corn crib, the story of what happened. Not hidden away, but presented honestly. A reminder that truth matters, that silence has costs, that demanding evidence before judgment is not just legal principle, but moral necessity." The idea grew over the following weeks. The farm would become the Hartford Agricultural Heritage Center. It would serve students and preserve history, teach farming and ethics, prepare young people for careers while teaching them to question authority, demand evidence, stand against injustice. The corn crib would remain at the center, not storage but memorial. They would preserve its structure, install displays, create exhibits telling Walter's story honestly. Visitors would enter through the same door Walter used, see where corn had packed around evidence, understand that this ordinary building had served extraordinary purpose. They established a board: Pastor Mills, Margaret Chen, Carl Brennan, Patricia Carver, Dorothy Hendricks, people who had lived the story from different angles, now working together to teach from it. Over months, the vision became reality. Grants secured, contractors hired, the house restored, the barn converted to classrooms, the corn crib transformed with reverent care. Inside the crib, Walter's notebooks behind glass, his photographs, the newspaper clippings, the physical evidence, all preserved, all teaching. The final exhibit, Walter's photograph from the early 1970s, standing before the farm. Beside it, a placard Tom and James had written together. Walter Hartford, 1943 to 2024. Farmer. Grandfather. Innocent man wrongly accused. He endured 40 years with dignity. He preserved truth when no one else would. He trusted someone would listen. This center exists because he was right. May we learn from his example. May we demand evidence before judgment. May we be braver than we were. The center opened on a Saturday in late spring, 1 year after Tom had arrived intending to sell quickly. The ceremony was simple: brief speeches, ribbon cutting, then tours. People came from across the state: farmers, students, educators, reporters, town residents. Tom stood with James at the corn crib entrance, watching visitors move through exhibits. Children asking questions, adults reading, processing, people leaving changed. An elderly woman approached using a cane. She looked Tom in the eye. "I knew your grandfather. He was kind to me once when I needed it. Helped repair my fence after my husband died. Would not accept payment. Said neighbors help neighbors. After Frank disappeared, I stopped speaking to him, afraid of what people would think. I have regretted that 40 years. I am glad you did this. I am glad his name is clear." She moved on, leaving Tom understanding that Walter's small kindnesses had been many, remembered but not defended. Perhaps the cruelest part, not just the accusation, but how it erased everything else about who he was. That evening, after the visitors had left and the center had closed, Tom and James walked the property together. They moved in comfortable silence, two brothers who had found their way back to each other through the work of honoring their grandfather. The tension that had existed between them for decades had dissolved, replaced by partnership and shared purpose. At Walter's grave in the small cemetery at the edge of town, they stood together as the sun descended. The headstone had been replaced months earlier. The new one was simple, dignified, chosen after long consideration of what words would be most true. Walter Hartford, beloved grandfather, man of integrity, falsely accused, truly innocent. His truth endured. Tom knelt and placed his hand on the stone, still warm from the day's sun. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice thick. "We finished what you started. People know now. They know you were innocent. They know what was done to you was wrong. They know your name deserves honor, not shame." The evening light that slanted across the cemetery, golden and forgiving. James stood beside him, hand on Tom's shoulder, and they remained there together until the sun touched the horizon and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue. Walking back to the truck, James spoke the question Tom knew was coming. "What will you do now? The center is established. It can run without you if you want. You could go back to Denver if you wanted, return to your life there." Tom had been thinking about this question for weeks. Denver felt very far away now, not in miles but in relevance. The life he had built there, the diesel garage and the simple routines, seemed thin somehow, constructed without foundation, maintained without deeper purpose. "I think I will stay," he said. "At least for a while. The center needs someone who understands why it exists, who can tell Walter's story from personal knowledge. And I am not ready to leave yet. Maybe I never will be." James nodded as if he had expected this answer. "I will visit more. Bring the family next month. Let the kids learn about their great-grandfather, about what happened here and why it matters that we remember." They drove back to the farm in the gathering dusk. The building stood solid against the darkening sky, lights from the new center buildings glowing warmly. The corn crib rose above it all, its distinctive shape unmistakable, a landmark now rather than an ordinary structure. Inside the farmhouse, which Tom kept for himself, they made dinner and ate at the kitchen table where so much had unfolded. After James left the next morning, Tom walked through the quiet house. He had made it his own while preserving its character. Still Walter's house, but also Tom's home now. He worked at the center daily, meeting students, sharing Walter's story. He became known not as the grandson of a suspected killer, but as the man who revealed truth, who built meaning from injustice. The town continued its reckoning. Some embraced the new narrative, others clung to old beliefs, but gradually the story settled into accepted history. Children learned about evidence and assumption, adults confronted uncomfortable truths. Walter's story became teaching material across the region. Letters arrived from people with wrongfully accused family members, lawyers, journalists, activists. Walter's vindication had become larger than itself, a symbol that truth could emerge even after decades. One year after opening, Tom stood in the corn crib at dawn, alone with exhibits and silence. Light filtered through the slats, same light that had illuminated corn for generations, now illuminating truth. He thought about the journey, arriving to sell and leave, the bundle in oilcloth changing everything. Evidence revealing not just what happened, but who Walter had been. A man of principle, patient, thorough, unwilling to break, faithful to truth. Tom had inherited more than land. He had inherited a legacy of endurance, a model of integrity, a testament to truth's power. At the final exhibit, Walter's a photograph, Tom spoke quietly. "I wish I had known you better, asked the questions, stood beside you. But I am standing now, making sure people know who you were, using what you left to teach others. I hope that counts. I hope you know your trust was not misplaced." Morning light grew stronger. Voices outside as staff arrived, school children coming to learn. Tom left the crib, ready to honor his grandfather through action, through teaching. The years passed, each one adding depth to the story. The center thrived. Students came from across the region. Scholars visited to study Walter's archive. Journalists interviewed Tom about wrongful accusation and vindication. Tom aged into the role of keeper of memory. He gave tours, his narrative polished through repetition, but never losing its core. He spoke to school groups about demanding evidence, about standing against popular opinion, about his own failure to question. He married Sarah Chen, a teacher at the center who understood rural life. She brought warmth to the farmhouse, made it home rather than memorial. James visited regularly with his growing family. The Hartford name became associated with integrity rather than shame. On the 5th anniversary, the state dedicated a historical marker. The governor spoke about confronting difficult history. Howard Carver Jr. attended, aged and diminished. Their eyes met. Howard nodded. Tom returned the gesture. Peace, if not friendship. That evening, Tom walked to the boundary line where Walter had found the box. He knelt, pressed his palm to the earth. Thank you, he said to Walter, to the land, to truth itself. The corn crib stood silhouetted against sunset, still serving, still teaching. Tom walked home to Sarah and dinner. After eating, he read Walter's letter again, the one found in the crib's final days. Grandson, I do not blame you for leaving. This place was poison. I hope you found something better. If you return and find this, know I never stopped being your grandfather. The truth is here if you want it. Either way, you were loved, even in silence. Tom folded the letter carefully. Those words had given him permission, had assured him Walter's trust was justified. He looked out at the lit corn crib, a landmark, a memorial, a teacher. The burden Walter carried 40 years had been set down, his truth acknowledged, his name cleared, his suffering transformed into teaching. Not perfect justice. That would have been belief from the beginning, but this was something, acknowledgement, transformation, meaning from suffering. Tom turned from the window, ready to move forward, carrying Walter's legacy as purpose, not burden. The past could not change, but the future could be shaped. Truth could be taught. Silence could be challenged. The corn crib stood watch, empty of corn, but full of meaning. A monument to one man's refusal to surrender. A testament that truth, once planted, will grow. Even if it takes 40 years. Even if those who planted it do not see the harvest. Even then, the truth remains. Walter Hartford had preserved. Tom Hartford had honored. Together, across death and time, they had completed what needed completing. The silence was broken. The truth was known, and the corn crib spoke volumes to everyone with ears to hear. The end. Pastor Mills organized a community meeting at the church, open to anyone who wanted to attend. Tom was hesitant about going, uncertain of his welcome, but James convinced him it mattered to be present. The church was full when they arrived, every pew occupied, people standing along the walls. Tom recognized faces from town. Some nodded as he passed, others looked away. A few watched with expressions he could not read, something between curiosity and resentment. Pastor Mills stood at the front, his white hair catching the light from the windows, and spoke with a gravity that commanded attention. We are here because we failed, he began. Not all of us directly, not all of us consciously, but collectively we failed. We allowed an innocent man to be condemned without proof. We participated in his isolation through our silence. We chose comfort over truth. And Walter Hartford paid the price for our choice. The church was silent. People shifted in their seats, but no one spoke. Some of you were not born when this happened, Pastor Mills continued. This is not your fault, but it is your inheritance. The town you grew up in was shaped by this injustice, by what we did and what we failed to do. Acknowledging that is the first step towards something better. He opened the floor for anyone who wanted to speak. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, haltingly, people began to stand. An elderly man Tom did not recognize spoke first. I was on the search party when we looked for Frank Carver. I remember thinking even then that it seemed wrong to focus only on Hartford. But I said nothing. I kept my doubts to myself. I am sorry for that. A woman in her 60s stood next. I was in high school when it happened. I remember how kids talked about Tom and James Hartford, how we treated them. We were cruel because we thought we were supposed to be, because the adults around us made it clear that the Hartford family was suspect. I participated in that cruelty. I am ashamed of it. One by one, people rose to confess their parts in the collective failure. Not everyone. Some sat rigid and silent, refusing to participate in what they clearly viewed as unnecessary self-flagellation. But enough people spoke to make clear that the acknowledgement was real, that something in the town's conscience was shifting. Beth from the diner stood, her voice breaking. I served Walter Hartford for 30 years after Frank disappeared. He came in every Tuesday, sat in the same booth, ordered the same thing, never caused trouble, never complained, And I never once told him I believed he was innocent. Never once offered kindness beyond basic service. He must have been so lonely. I think about that now and it breaks my heart. Tom felt his throat tighten. Hearing these confessions, these late recognitions of Walter's humanity, was almost harder than the years of silence had been, because they confirmed what he had suspected, that people had known, or at least doubted, but had chosen safety over courage. Near the end, Howard Carver Jr. stood. The room grew very quiet. Howard looked diminished, older than his years, his face drawn with what looked like genuine anguish. "My father was guilty," he said simply, "of what exactly we may never know for certain, but guilty of something. And I spent 60 years defending him without questioning, without asking the questions I should have asked. I benefited from land that was stolen, from a reputation built on lies. I am selling the ranch, returning the 60 acres to the Hartford estate. It does not undo anything, but it is what I can do." He sat down heavily. Someone in the back started clapping, then others joined, until the church filled with applause. Not celebration exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement of the difficulty of what Howard had said, of the cost it represented. When the meeting ended, people approached Tom, some to apologize, others to thank him for bringing the truth forward, a few just to shake his hand, wordless but present. He accepted it all with as much grace as he could manage, though the emotional toll was immense. Outside, standing in the parking lot as people dispersed, James put his hand on Tom's shoulder. "That was important," he said. "Not just for them, for us too." Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The legal process moved faster than Tom had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, a judge ruled that the 1984 land transfer had been based on fraudulent documents and was therefore void. The 60 acres legally reverted to the Hartford estate, which now meant Tom and James as Walter's heirs. Howard Carver Jr. did not contest the ruling. He signed the necessary paperwork without argument, then listed the remainder of his ranch for sale. The Cedar Ridge Gazette ran a story about the end of the Carver ranching empire, 3 generations reduced to legal documents and real estate listings. Tom felt no satisfaction in Howard's fall, only a kind of sad recognition that justice, even when served, rarely felt like victory. It felt more like accounting. Balances corrected, debts acknowledged if not fully paid. The brothers met with lawyers to discuss what to do with the farm and the recovered land. They could sell it all, split the proceeds, return to their separate lives. They could keep it as investment property, lease it to farmers, maintain ownership without presence. They had options. But neither option felt right. It was James who first suggested the alternative. "What if we turn it into something that honors what happened here?" he said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Not a museum exactly, but a place that teaches, that preserves the story." Tom considered this. "What did you have in mind?" "An agricultural education center," James said, "for kids from the region who want to learn farming. Scholarships for students who could not otherwise afford it, and part of the property preserved as it is. The house, the corn crib, the story of what happened. A reminder that truth matters, that silence has costs." The idea grew over the following weeks. They consulted with educators, with agricultural extension programs, with historians who specialized in rural America. A plan took shape. The farm would become the Hartford Agricultural Heritage Center. It would serve students and preserve history in equal measure. The corn crib would remain at the center of it all, not as storage but as memorial. They would preserve its structure, install displays that told Walter's story, create a space where people could understand what had been at stake and what had been lost. Tom found himself energized by the vision. This was not just closure, it was transformation, taking a place of suffering and turning it into a place of learning, ensuring that what Walter had endured would not be forgotten, that it would instead teach future generations about the importance of questioning, of demanding evidence, of standing against injustice even when it was unpopular. They established a board of directors. Pastor Mills agreed to serve. Margaret Chen from the library, Carl Brennan, despite his age and failing health, Patricia Carver, Frank's widow, who said she wanted something good to come from all the pain, and Dorothy Hendricks, the former county clerk who had processed fraudulent documents and lived with that guilt for decades. The board met monthly, planning curriculum, discussing fundraising, arguing about details with the passion of people who believed the work mattered. Tom attended every meeting, contributing when he had something to offer, learning when he did not. Slowly over months, the vision became reality. Grants were secured, contractors hired. The house was restored carefully, preserving its character while updating its infrastructure. The barn was stabilized and converted to classroom space. Fencing was repaired. Fields prepared for demonstration crops. And the corn crib was transformed. Its exterior remained unchanged, weathered wood and solid construction. But inside, they installed climate control to preserve documents, lighting to illuminate displays, interpretive materials that walked visitors through the timeline of what had happened. Walter's notebooks were there, displayed behind glass. The photographs he had taken, the newspaper clippings that had convicted him without trial, the physical evidence from the metal box, Frank Carver's journal, the fraudulent survey documents. All of it preserved, explained, offered as testimony to what happens when systems fail and good people stay silent. The final exhibit was the simplest and most powerful, a photograph of Walter Hartford, taken sometime in the 1970s before everything changed. He stood in front of the farm, wearing work clothes, his expression serious but not unhappy. Beside the photograph, a placard with words Tom and James had written together. Walter Hartford, 1943 to 2024. Farmer. Grandfather. Innocent man wrongly accused. He endured 40 years of undeserved suspicion with dignity and patience. He preserved the truth when no one else would. He trusted that eventually someone would listen. This center exists because he was right. Truth matters. Silence has costs. May we learn from both. The Hartford Agricultural Heritage Center opened on a Saturday in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after Tom had first arrived at the farm intending to sell it quickly and leave. The ceremony was simple: a few speeches, a ribbon cutting, tours of the facilities. People came from across the state, farmers and students and educators, reporters documenting the transformation, town residents, some supportive, some simply curious, and former witnesses, people who had been part of the original story, coming to see how it had been memorialized. Tom stood with James at the entrance to the corn crib, watching visitors move through the exhibits, seeing them stop to read the displays, to study the documents, to absorb the weight of what had happened here. An elderly woman approached him using a cane, her movements careful. She stopped and looked at him directly. "I knew your grandfather," she said. "Not well, but I knew him. He was kind to me once when I needed kindness. After Frank disappeared, I stopped speaking to him. I was afraid of what people would think if I was seen being friendly to a suspected killer. I have regretted that for 40 years. I am glad you did this. I am glad his name is clear." She moved on before Tom could respond, leaving him with the recognition that there were probably hundreds of small kindnesses Walter had offered over his life, acts of decency that people remembered but had not defended him for. That was perhaps the cruelest part of what had been done to him. Not just the false accusation, but the way it had erased everything else about who he was. That evening, after the visitors had left and the center had closed, Tom and James walked the property together. They moved in comfortable silence, two brothers who had found their way back to each other through the work of honoring their grandfather. At Walter's grave in the small cemetery at the edge of town, they stood together. The headstone had been replaced. The new one was simple, dignified. Walter Hartford, beloved grandfather, man of integrity, falsely accused, truly innocent. His truth endured. Tom knelt and placed his hand on the stone, still warm from the day's sun. "We did it," he said quietly. "We finished what you started. People know now. They know you were innocent. They know what was done to you was wrong." The evening light slanted across the cemetery, golden and forgiving. James stood beside him, hand on his shoulder, and they remained there until the sun touched the horizon and the first stars appeared. Walking back to the truck, James spoke. "What will you do now? The center is established. You could go back to Denver if you wanted, return to your life there." Tom had been thinking about this question for weeks. Denver felt very far away now, not in miles but in relevance. The life he had built there seemed thin somehow, constructed without foundation, maintained without purpose. "I think I will stay," he said. "At least for a while. The center needs someone, and I am not ready to leave yet." James nodded as if he had expected this answer. "I will visit more, bring the family. Let the kids learn about their great-grandfather, about what happened here and why it matters." They drove back to the farm in the gathering dusk. The building stood solid against the darkening sky. Lights from the new center buildings glowed warmly. The corn crib rose above it all, its distinctive shape unmistakable. Inside the farmhouse, which Tom had kept for himself rather than converting it to educational use, they made dinner together and ate at the kitchen table where so much of this journey had unfolded. The table where Tom had first spread Walter's documents, where he had read through decades of careful record-keeping, where he and James had reconciled and planned and built something that honored their grandfather's endurance. After James left the next morning, heading back to St. Louis with promises to return soon, Tom walked through the quiet house. He had made it his own over the past months, adding small comforts, updating what needed updating, but preserving its essential character. It was still Walter's house. It always would be. But it was also Tom's home now, and that felt right in ways he had not anticipated. He spent his days working at the center, helping establish programs, meeting with students, sharing Walter's story with visitors who came from increasing distances to learn about the man who had preserved truth in a corn crib. He became known locally not as the grandson of a suspected killer, but as the man who had revealed the truth, who had built something meaningful from injustice. The town continued its own process of reckoning. Some embraced the new narrative quickly. Others clung to old beliefs, insisting that the official findings did not prove innocence, only failed to prove guilt. A few remained openly hostile, viewing the Heritage Center as an attack on the community's values. But gradually over time, the story settled into accepted history. Children who visited the center learned about the importance of evidence and the danger of assumption. Adults who toured the exhibits confronted uncomfortable truths about human nature and the ease with which good people can participate in injustice. Walter's story became teaching material in schools across the region, a cautionary tale about the presumption of innocence, about the need for thorough investigation, about the cost of silence. Tom received letters from people whose own family members had been wrongly accused, who saw in Walter's story echoes of their own struggles. He heard from lawyers working wrongful conviction cases, from journalists investigating cold cases, from activists fighting against systemic injustice. Walter's vindication had become larger than itself, a symbol of the possibility that truth could emerge even after decades of suppression. 1 year after the center opened, Tom stood in the corn crib at dawn, alone with the exhibits and the silence. Light was just beginning to filter through the slatted walls, the same light that had illuminated corn for generations, now illuminating truth. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, how he had arrived intending to spend a few days disposing of an unwanted inheritance, how the discovery of a bundle wrapped in oilcloth had changed everything, how the slow accumulation of evidence had revealed not just what had happened to Walter, but who Walter had been, a man of principle, patient, thorough, unwilling to be broken by injustice. Tom had inherited more than land and buildings. He had inherited a legacy of endurance, a model of how to maintain integrity when the world insists you surrender it, a testament to the power of truth preserved even when no one seems to care. He walked through the exhibit slowly, reading the placards as if for the first time, seeing Walter's handwriting, the careful documentation, the preserved evidence. It was all still here, still speaking, still teaching. At the final exhibit, the photograph of Walter standing before the farm, Tom stopped and studied his grandfather's face. There was strength there, but also weariness. The photograph had been taken before the accusation, but Walter already looked like a man who understood hardship, who had learned not to expect ease. "I wish I had known you better," Tom said to the photograph. "I wish I had asked the questions I was afraid to ask. I wish I had stood beside you. But I am standing now. I am making sure people know who you really were. I am using what you left me to teach others. I hope that counts for something." The morning light grew stronger. Tom heard voices outside as staff arrived to prepare for the day's visitors. He left the corn crib and walked to the house, ready to begin another day of honoring his grandfather's memory through action rather than regret. The months passed into years. The center thrived. Students came and learned. Visitors toured and understood. The story of Walter Hartford became part of the region's history, taught and retold, preserved in the very place where it had unfolded. Tom aged into the role of keeper of memory. He gave tours when asked, spoke to school groups, maintained the exhibits with reverent care. He dated a teacher who worked at the center, a woman named Sarah, who had grown up in a town nearby and who understood rural life and its complexities. They married quietly, a small ceremony at the church with Pastor Mills officiating. James visited regularly, bringing his children, then eventually his grandchildren. The farm became a place of family gathering again, of connection and continuity. The Hartford name, once associated with shame, became associated with integrity and the courage to seek truth. On the 5th anniversary of the center's opening, the State Historical Society dedicated a marker on the property, official recognition of its significance. The ceremony drew a crowd, including the current governor, who spoke about the importance of confronting difficult history, of learning from past failures. Tom stood at the back of the crowd watching. Howard Carver Jr. was there too, aged considerably, using a walker now. Their eyes met across the gathering. Howard nodded slightly. Tom returned the gesture. No friendship would ever exist between them, but a kind of peace had been reached. An acknowledgement that they were both part of this story, both shaped by it, both trying in their own ways to make something right from something wrong. That evening, as the sun set over the fields, Tom walked out to the boundary line where Walter had found the metal box, where the physical evidence of Howard Carver Sr.'s presence had been buried and then recovered. The land looked no different from any other section of the property. Grass and soil, patient and enduring. But Tom knew what it held, what it remembered. The land was witness to everything, the arguments and threats, the disappearance, the decades of Walter's solitary endurance, and now the transformation, the healing that was imperfect but real. He knelt and pressed his palm to the ground, feeling its coolness, its solidity. "Thank you," he said, though he was not entirely sure who he was thanking. Walter, the land, the truth itself. When he stood, he saw the corn crib silhouetted against the darkening sky, solid, enduring, still standing after all these years, serving a purpose Walter could not have imagined when he built it, but a purpose that honored everything he had tried to preserve. Tom walked back to the house as stars emerged overhead. Sarah had dinner waiting. They ate together at the kitchen table, talking about the day, about plans for the center's expansion, about the student who had been awarded the first Walter Hartford Memorial Scholarship. After dinner, Tom went to his study and pulled out the letter Walter had left for him, the one he had found in the final days of clearing the corn crib. He read it again, though he had memorized every word. "Grandson, I do not blame you for leaving. This place was poisoned by what they believe about me. I hope wherever you went, you found something better. If someday you come back and find this, know that I never stopped being your grandfather, even when the world said I was something worse. The truth is here if you want it. If you do not, I will understand that too. Either way, you were loved. You are loved, even in silence." Tom folded the letter carefully and returned it to its place. Those words had given him permission to do what needed to be done, had assured him that Walter's trust had not been misplaced. He walked to the window and looked out at the corn crib, lit now by spotlights that made it visible even in darkness. A landmark, a memorial, a teacher. The burden Walter had carried for 40 years had finally been set down. The truth he had preserved had been acknowledged. His name had been cleared, his integrity recognized. It was not perfect justice. Perfect justice would have been belief from the beginning, would have been a community that demanded evidence before judgment, would have been a system that protected the innocent rather than convenience. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was transformation. It was the creation of meaning from suffering. And it was enough. Tom turned from the window and went to find Sarah, ready to move forward, carrying Walter's legacy not as burden, but as purpose. The past could not be changed, but the future could be shaped. Truth could be preserved and taught. Silence could be broken. The corn crib stood watch over it all, empty of corn but full of meaning. A monument to one man's patience. A testament to the possibility that truth, once planted, will eventually grow. Even if it takes 40 years. Even if those who planted it do not live to see the harvest. Even then the truth remains. Waiting, enduring, ready to be discovered by those brave enough to look. Walter Hartford had looked, had documented, had preserved. And Tom Hartford had found, had spoken, had honored. Together, across the divide of death and time, grandfather and grandson had finished what needed finishing. The silence was broken. The truth was known. And the corn crib stood testament to both, solid and enduring beneath the stars, a reminder that some things are worth preserving, that patience has power, and that truth, however long buried, will find its way into light. The story was complete. The work would continue. And in the fields of eastern Colorado, on land that had witnessed injustice and endurance, restoration and teaching, the Hartford legacy grew into something Walter could never have imagined, but would have recognized as true. A place where silence was not accepted, where questions were encouraged, where truth mattered more than comfort, where one man's suffering had been transformed into many people's learning. The corn crib stood at the center of it all, empty of grain, full of meaning, silent, but speaking volumes.